You just heard At the Edge of the Nebula Mortis, from Procession to the Infraworld, from the Chasm. This is the Rock Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And we're back in the land of extreme metal once again, Mark. Kind of been deviating back and forth into some nuanced areas, you know, going from Gehenna to Dead Kennedys and then Misfits. And now we're into kind of semi-cultish, obscure. I don't want to say obscure, but definitely not as well known as some death metal acts of the last couple decades, you know?
Oh, sure. Definitely cultish is or underground is definitely the term to use for these guys.
I mean, they're appreciated for sure by like a lot of people, but it's, and it's kind of cool. It's our first venture into Mexico, which is kind of nice, you know, to get geographically more diverse a little, you know?
Yeah, I guess we haven't really done anything there.
Done South America, but we have not done haven't done Mexico yet. So, but what you just heard there was from the 2000s kind of masterpiece that a lot of people think is amongst, you know, it's kind of hotly debated what is the essential, the Chasm record, but certainly Procession to the Infraworld, which we'll talk about later, is one. That was the one that came out on Dwell Records, and we'll talk about how they got to Dwell and all that a little bit later. But you know, you get kind of a perfect introduction to the band there with some kind of Gorguts, Cryptopsy type drumming there, kind of doomy, chilling riffs that kind of swirl kind of in the sea of like dissection. There's some Inquisition kind of riffery there, almost like Gateways of Annihilation, Morbid Angel stuff kind of happening. You know, buzzsaw production, yet it's kind of still mysterious, and it's got these like arcane kind of qualities to it, as the song title suggests, that it's got this kind of weird mystical kind of thing that they're sort of all about, which
it's very like Absu sounding as far as the titles and, you know, all the different you know, subcategories and things in parentheses than every other song. And
I didn't find any indication as to like why that was, but the one thing I did pick up on in kind of doing some research, and I was able to find a lot of old interviews with Daniel. We'll introduce Daniel Corchado, who's basically the guy from the Chasm.
Everything but drums.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And, but you know, some of it has to do kind of with their origin points. And I thought that was kind of neat. That was something maybe I never really picked up on, you know, just he kind of tried to harken back at times to some of the mystical pre-Columbus kind of aspects of that society, whether it be, you know, Aztecs, Mayans, you know, Incan, you know, pagan culture, you know, that was both advanced and sometimes kind of like mysterious and all those kind of weird things all kind of moving together. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of pretty cool. And I think like one thing that I've kind of taken from trying to understand the Chasm, and this is a band I've wanted to sort of penetrate for a long time and try and understand. And I think even when we were building those CD shelves last summer out on my patio, I was like, dude, you know, I kind of want to do a Chasm show down the road, but it's a lot to digest and I'm still processing it. And you were like, oh yeah, this sounds pretty cool. You know, I go back to like this great quote from David Vincent, where he kind of famously said about death metal that it's limitless. And I think like the Chasm is like the perfect example of like a limitless band that, yeah, they're death metal. And like he always wanted to sort of be that, you know, he never, you know, tried to glob on to like any other trends that were sort of happening, but he is also absorbing like all these other things, you know, he never, I don't know, like I said, in that riff in the song you heard there are some kind of dissection-y kind of riffs here and there. There will be immortal riffs in some places, some early Dark Throne riffs here and there. And I don't think it's because he was like into black metal or anything. From what I've interviewed, you know, or from what I've gleaned from the interviews, he was just somebody that was really, really passionate. And I think sometimes those kind of things like kind of accidentally happened because he was so imaginative about how he wanted to like set up his compositions and things like that. So he inevitably kind of taps into like other weird genres from time to time. But, you know, tried and true, he was kind of like, even in the good times and bad times of, you know, the mid and late 90s, you know, doldrums of American-ish, you know, death metal, like he was still kind of flying the flag. And, you know, there weren't a lot of bands that were doing that in America or that were doing it with as much like panache as him, and I think that's something that's really cool, because death metal really did sort of fade out a bit, at least from the mainstream in the mid 90s, especially in America.
Yeah, especially what we're used to, the more American sounding, guttural death metal stuff.
Yeah, and he's definitely has that, but it's like more. Like, well, he's still, definitely like. Oh, go ahead.
One of the things he manages to do throughout the entire career and even into the other projects that he does is that there's like that young person's kind of like, let's throw 14 riffs in here, 20 time changes, and at first it's kind of like a little archaic and feels like it's going to fall over, but by the end it's like it's like, okay, this is just his toolbox he uses to kind of construct everything, is through ridiculously like and then every song has like a super epic guitar solo where like you see him in silhouette on the side of a mountain, where it starts out really like kind of sorrowful and then triumphantly like kind of like comes out of that. Almost every single solo has that.
I mean, and he even like, he downplays himself, like he's kind of like, I'm an average guitar player. And he's like, I've never really considered myself much of like a great guitar player. I'm not that technical. And I think to some extent I get what he's saying, because he isn't super technical, but he's got a ton of feel. Like I put him in like a Gregor McIntosh or Anders kind of camp, in that like they're not going to play like, Eddie Van Halen type shit or, George Lynch shit, but like they have such an incredible emotive feel that you just kind of know is theirs, and it works for whatever they're always doing, Yeah,
he's not Eddie Van Halen, but he definitely likes his hammer-ons, and
he definitely does
that dissonant fucking Freezing Moon mayhem riff. That's in almost every single song.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, are you kidding me? And I kept going through and like, okay. And he does it slightly different throughout the thing, but it's really funny that he actually managed to keep that through almost every song, that at least that's in our playlist.
I think like that's where like I kept globbing onto like a band like Inquisition, and Inquisition's not a band like, that we're probably comfortable doing an episode on, but like, they're very musically talented and inventive, and a lot of those riffs are really fucking cool, and it always kind of had that whatever, maybe that's that kind of Freezing Moon kind of thing that you're sort of talking about, but that weird guitar technique. Yeah, it was always kind of there, and I noticed it a little bit throughout like his trajectory of what he sort of does, so. But for people, that might be kind of coming to us through the last couple episodes, which were, definitely left of center for us a little bit, and maybe bigger bands than what we're used to always doing. We don't always do obscure, but we don't always do, bigger bands as well. Basically Requiem Metal Podcast, here you are. We're doing deep dives, especially the last couple of years. We've been kind of going more historical context, more, trying to use interview clips and as much kind of research as humanly possible. But basically Mark and I's background is we came up in mid-Michigan together, along with a mutual friend of ours who's a writer for Decibel, Chris Dick. And we all worked at the same record store, New Moon Records, and Mark and Chris were doing a zine called Requiem, which is where our name comes from. And then Mark, you ended up working for Relapse for a bit, doing a lot of art design and stuff there, right?
Yeah, I was, I guess, assistant. I mean, I just found one of my business cards, actually. It just has my name. But I was assistant art director because there's only two of us.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah, I did that for a while, and then went on to all kinds of other aspects of, publishing, and worked for newspapers and, illustrations for magazines. And then we went on to do a new zine together with me and you and Chris. Eclipse magazine that went for another 7 issues, just like Requiem did.
Yeah. So, and that was kind of 97 through 2002, I think was the final issue. And then we were all kind of wrapping up college around that time. And so things kind of dissipated a bit there. And then I moved downstate. So did you eventually. And Chris was out in Philly at that point. And then you and I kind of decided to put this all together and, said, hey, we fuck around. We talk about metal. Let's just record it. And I didn't really know much about podcasts, and you had been kind of at the zenith of the beginning of that movement, kind of listening to stuff and doing your own art podcast.
2008, April 1st, 2008 is when we started.
That's it. April Fools. There you go.
I got it right on a sticky note next to the desk.
Yep. So, so now we're kind of the old dogs of the metal podcasting genre. Been at it for a while. So, but to keep ourselves hungry, we've been kind of, like you said, doing more of these academic kind of deep dives. It's kind of the way that I think my brain as a history teacher works, and Mark as a deeply passionate person about art and creativity and the all those kind of things kind of coalesce together and kind of keep it balanced, So
yeah, the researching new stuff is like, and then finding context and with things you already know, and that's like getting older and just discovering how everything's interconnected in certain ways makes the show like, super satisfying on the research end.
Absolutely. And so, but yeah, just in case you're joining us, I always forget. I listen to a lot of podcasts where they always introduce themselves and introduce the concept of the podcast to the beginning. And I'm always like, why did they do that? And then I think of the old, I think we were just talking about comic stuff before we started recording. I think it was like Jim Shooter, right? Who said like, all writers at Marvel have to write as if maybe this is the first time that a kid is ever picking up a comic book, and so you have to
could be somebody's first.
Try and work, so if this is your first Requiem because you're a death metal fan, then welcome to it. So, but I would imagine most of you are returning fans here. So,
well, we have the taglines: a history teacher and artist talk about metal.
That's it. Yeah, we kind of do the NPR of metal a little bit. So, but we are going to do something today with the Chasm that was kind of a suggestion from one of our patrons, friend of podcast, Brian Wendorf from Chicago. And hey, Chicago band. So there you go, Brian, this is for you. But he was kind of like, man, it'd be nice to sort of break the episodes up just a little bit. So it's a little bit more kind of digestible, part 1, part 2, which makes sense, and then release them at the exact same time. That's what my wrestling podcast I listen to does when they do the kind of deep historical dives. And
I don't think we realized how long the last episode is going to be.
Yeah, I know.
I thought maybe 4.5 hours, and that was off by 2.
The Misfit stuff, the music's so short, you just kind of assume, it wasn't going to add up to much, but we got some good conversation there with Blake and stuff, good research. So, but yeah, so like basically, as we kind of turn back into the Chasm, the kind of origins of this whole band sort of start with the aforementioned Daniel Corchado. He is really the Chasm, along with the drummer, and we'll get to him in a bit. But his start is in the Mexican sort of metal scene that was kind of rumbling in the late 80s, namely Mexico City, where alongside a guy named Oscar Clario, they form a band called Damned Cross in 1987. And they released a couple demos, including Excretion of Infected Corpses, before there was some kind of lineup changes. And once those lineup changes kind of happened, it prompted a name to sort of switch to Cenotaph, which, by the way, Mark, for people who don't know, is a tomb in honor of a person whose remains are elsewhere. So
it's a very good bolt thrower single.
There you go. Yeah. Speaking of bolt thrower, we are recording this on our ultimate bolt thrower fan and number 1 Patreon, Andreas's birthday. So happy birthday, Andreas.
Happy birthday, buddy.
You won't hear this until after your birthday, but there you go. But yeah, so that's when they kind of formed the band Cenotaph, where Clario is going to be on drums, and then Daniel's going to be on vocals and bass. Although we did some guitar work on some of their demos for Cenotaph, but when it comes to actual gloomy reflection of our Hidden Sorrows album, it's other guys. Cesar Sanchez and Guillermo Delgado are going to be the guitar players. And they put out kind of 2 EPs in 1990-91, the Tenebrous Apparitions, and then the Eternal Disgrace EPs, before a label, I'm assuming out of Mexico, I think, called Horus Productions, puts out their blistering debut in 1992, which is called The Gloomy Reflections of Our Hidden Sorrows.
I think we might have actually reviewed one of these demos.
I was just going to ask you, did you guys know much about Cenotaph back?
I remember the band. I mean, because because of both I picked up it was either got one of the maybe the first full length, the Gloomy Reflections, or I'll have to look after the show and see if we actually did a review of one of these.
Yeah, I forgot to go back and look to see. I looked in Eclipses to see if we did any Chasm interviews, and we didn't. I think we reviewed Procession to the Infraworld in an Eclipse issue, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, we didn't do any interviews that I could find, at least.
And most of the interviews that I've read with Daniel too are very kind of Almost like the dude from Inquisition, where it's not really talking about literal things, but more like weird ideas behind the whole,
gotcha.
Kind of more archaic kind of stuff. And not like, how was the division of labor for this? He's like, goes into a more philosophical tangent.
I definitely came across some of that, and it's really weird. I was actually speaking, we reached out to Daniel, and I didn't hear anything back. I got a hold of his record company that he runs, the Lux record company. And I reached out to a guy who, he does his own zine as well, called Brandon Corsair. Mm-hmm. And he does, what's the name of his zine? I should have written it down. I have it written down somewhere. The Highway Corsair is he does like a zine. I've got a few of his issues, but he also is a writer for Invisible Oranges, and he runs the Nameless Grave record label and stuff like that.
Okay.
And I'd seen like him do like a review of the Chasm record, and I was like, well, he seems to like have some insight. So I kind of reached out and just asked him a couple questions about some stuff, and he just said like, Daniel doesn't do stuff about the Chasm anymore. He just, what I'm going to find it. Yeah, it says he's 100% done talking about that band. And he says he still does Acerus ones, but, that's basically, he's a guy in his 50s, and he's just kind of tired, I think, of talking about the Chasm a little bit. So kind of. So
there wasn't any like big thing, some ideological change he went
Not
through. He doesn't
really.
want to talk about stuff. Or?
No. And then I've got some insight when we get to like the end of like why he got, Brandon kind of gave me some insight into like why Daniel doesn't do vocals anymore on the Chasm's like later stuff and things like that. So I'll share some of that. But so we've been trying to do like some kind of like journalistic endeavors for most of our episodes, either trying to get somebody from the band or somebody that knows the band or, some kind of connection of some sort. And, like I said, we tried, just didn't happen. So, but luckily, Mark, I found some old Metal Maniacs issues that I had.
But you're gonna write off for your taxes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, these are ones I owned from back in the day, that I've held on to. But yeah, so we'll get some insight from Daniel, just not audio clips of Daniel.
Yeah, if anybody's looking to get any of these on vinyl, good luck.
Oh shit, I can only imagine.
Everything is $140.
I mean, the CDs were expensive. Some of the ones I tracked down to get because I
remember seeing these things years ago too, and I was just like, I don't like the drop shadow they use, so I'm just like,
yeah. No, I remember the Procession of the Infraworld CD on Dwell at New Moon for quite a while, and I remember Brian was way into it, and he tried turning us on, and I just don't know why I didn't pay more attention to him. I think I had this bad like taste in my mouth of a lot of generic kind of like Mexican death metal bands at Milwaukee Metal Fest. And I just was like, I'm sure that's what this bullshit is. And it wasn't, but I just didn't know any better, But
plus you're dealing with like polished, stuff like Dissection and At the Gates. And when this gets thrown at you, it's like, oh, that production's kind of weird. The drum sound, everything's kind of like a weird mix in some of this early stuff, especially.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if I would have come across, I think I knew who Cenotaph were, but I don't think I ever saw their stuff. But basically what you're getting kind of on the Gloomy Reflection of Our Hidden Sorrows record is, it's got like kind of an early Sentence, Shadows kind of feel, some Carnage thrown in there. There's definitely like some of the like, Demigod, Slumber of Sullen Eyes kind of vibes here and there. Early Incantation, Immolation. Definitely Autopsy, Sadistic Intent is in there. I don't know if you remember those guys.
I do, but I couldn't picture or pull out any of their traits in anybody else's music.
Yeah, they had a pretty awesome EP called the Resurrection EP. It's fucks pretty hard. It's good. And they did, you might remember they did a cover Return to Eve on that Dwell Celtic Frost tribute. That's actually pretty awesome. So, Daniel, I got a quote from him here. He says, we were really into Incubus, Messiah, Napalm Death, Grave, Carcass. And I remember listening to Immolation's second demo a lot. We were trying to do something like that. But of course, we were also obsessed with the Brazilian scene too, like Sepultura, Sarcophago, and Panic. And for that time in Mexico, it was really underground. So it's like this kind of cauldron of all these kind of different sort of influences and stuff like that, right? And I'll get to some of Daniel's, like his influences a little bit later, because he kind of goes through and lists a whole bunch of them in an interview clip that I kind of found. But basically what we want to do is just kind of a shorter intro sort of talk set here. But, you know, kind of play you what these two kind of a pair of Cenotaph tunes kind of sound like, just so you can get a feel for where Daniel's kind of foundational stuff is. And then we'll sort of, you know, kind of come back after that and set up sort of all the Chasm stuff. But basically, you know, these two songs, Tenebrous, Apparitions, and In the Cosmic Solitude, cool name. You know, Oscar is on, you know, he's drumming a very barbarian style here, especially on Tenebrous. It's pretty cool. His blasts and kicks and hi-hats are kind of fun. Mm-hmm. Daniel's great on the vocals here. You know, he's obviously showing off like his vocal traits, and we'll talk more about the stuff he did with Incantation on vocals. It's, you know, he's a great vocalist, you know.
Well,
I don't know.
Do you know what his involvement was as far as writing the riffs were as well?
What's that? For Cenotaph?
Yeah,
he wrote a lot of the early demo stuff, but I think like at the time he didn't consider himself much of a guitar player. He was more of a bass player. So he's playing the bass, but I think he's kind of like the Nikki Sixx of the band, if that makes sense.
He's like writing riffs and giving it to somebody else to play.
I'm sure that's what's happening.
Because if you look at, you know, the structure of these songs, it's way too similar. You know, as far as like lots, I put what is it, spin the wheel of styles for death metal, like the different types of riffs and like how many there are and time changes and stuff. It's kind of nuts.
And that's what I mean. He's like into Brazilian stuff, the Swedish stuff, the American stuff. And maybe that was the advantage of being like a South American, you know, Mexican, you know, band, is that like, there's no expectations on you. You can just kind of like steal from like all the menus, you know, or all the buffet, you know?
Yeah. But even it almost sounds like this is totally just me, you know, guessing or speculating about shit, but the way it's produced and all the riffs and the muddiness of it almost feels like they're trying to replicate a tape that's been, you know, traded around 5 or 6 times. That's kind of like slightly off, because there's a lot of riffs on this that are not in tune. They're not notes. They're noises that they put together in a really interesting, you know, kind of way. And I don't know. Later in his career, he ends up really kind of like, okay, this is the riff you're supposed to do and blah, blah, blah. But early on, it's just like a lot of, it sounds like just fucking around, but it sounds awesome.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think, you know, he'll talk later in some interview clips that I have about like just how kind of low rent some of the Mexico equipment was in the recording studios. Like it's very primitive, you know, so it's almost like the thing I think I would maybe compare this to and see if you could kind of, you know, run with me on this one is it sort of reminds me of like the early sort of Greek scene that we talked about, or like even some of the Eastern European stuff.
A lot of Rotting Christ vibes here, as far as how things are, the songwriting is concerned.
Exactly. And just like how lo-fi the production is and how that adds like a certain quality to it that I don't know if I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it adds like an atmosphere that like you wouldn't get in a, you know, Scott Burns studio or Skogsberg or, you know, things like that. Right.
No, not at all. Yeah.
You know, I mean, those places had their own unique atmosphere for sure. And you can kind of like respond to them. And I have great love for them, but there's also something kind of like mystical about where the fuck did Rotting Christ like record this stuff, or like where the fuck did this Czech, you know, the Root record this, or, you know, Death SS or you know, all those like just weird sounding records. And I'd almost put like early, you know, Cenotaph and the Chasm and all these kind of Mexican bands, you know, like in that sort of realm a little bit, is they just didn't have access to the same kind of, you know, circumstances to record this stuff, you know,
which I think gives them longevity. And also I think it gives the reason this stuff sounds more palatable now than it did back then is because there's like 50 bands that are on Hell's Headbangers and all these other like more, you know, underground metal labels that are trying to like capture this kind of energy. That the lo-fi, you know, like we're recording this on a tape player with, you know, just plugging into a boombox kind of thing. And back like when this first popped out, and if I would have heard any of it, I would have been like, because I was used to like just polished, clean, you know, all this like stuff that was coming out of Morris Sound or whatever.
Yeah, you want a Harmony Corruption or, you know, something like that, right?
And this does get some typewriter drums a little bit later on in the show. We get to hear a little bit of that. It sounds like when I used to try to like mimic the speed on like a shoebox just with my fingers to try to do it. And it's like, you could put a mic in there and that's what it sounded like.
Yeah, no, I can definitely hear that. And I think like, the other thing I think is so cool about this, and one of the reasons I selected these two Cenotaph tunes in particular is, Daniel's on bass, and you can really hear his bass playing on these two songs. Like it comes through in a weird way. It's popping off in weird kind of like, it's hard to explain, but like, people who hear this will know what I'm saying. Like, some bass is really buried on a lot of death metal, depending on which band you're kind of talking about. And I don't think it's like, I don't know if it's the way it was just recorded, but it's got like that weird, like Cryptopsy bass or something like that. But obviously Cryptopsy's produced a lot better, but like,
it's probably not as distorted as much.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is, but
you can hear the notes.
It kind of comes through, and you can really hear like Daniel's chops on bass on these two songs. And since he's kind of the focal point of really the episodes, I was like, well, we might as well shine a light on that a little. But
yeah,
like, I don't know, like you can just tell like his song composition chops are kind of above average. His playing might not be, but like he's got some ideas in his head. And I think especially in the Cosmic Solitude, you've got this like creepy sort of doomy atmosphere all throughout. And again, you hear more of his kind of bass and compositional chops. And I think the record that and he's talked about in some interviews that he like has great love for this record, and I think it had a profound influence on his brain, is Soulside Journey. And I think like
makes a lot of sense because they threw about 40 riffs against the wall.
Yeah.
And then kept going.
Like, took that as a template almost, or like Clandestine or something like that. And he's like, well, this is going to be maybe our thing,
yeah. There's also a lot of early peaceful doom, Candlemass stuff coming through.
Yeah. And that's one of his favorite bands is Candlemass. So
okay, that makes sense.
when we set up the Chasm, we'll talk about that for sure. But I think like, when you hear in these two songs, like you hear kind of a cool synth opening, especially in Tenebrous here. But, Middle Eastern kind of riffs and things like that, and the solos, especially in the Cosmic Solitude.
The old, they definitely have the old PL kind of like phaser guitar kind of sound.
Yep, absolutely. So, so I think let's check out these Cenotaph tunes, and then we'll kind of get back and really get into the meat of who the Chasm is all about. So we've got from the gloomy reflection of our hidden sorrows from 1992, we have Tenebrous Apparitions and In the Cosmic Solitude. That was In the Cosmic Solitude and Tenebrous Apparitions from Cenotaphs, the gloomy reflection of our hidden sorrows. So also we should let Requiem fans know that I am trying out some new equipment today, Mark.
We've got a new mic on them, so...
Yeah, we're doing this from Zoom, not in person, just because we couldn't make it happen. But my school has some old podcasting equipment that apparently they ordered for the district, and they just kind of were like, "We're not using this anymore. Do you want it?" I'm like, "Sure, yeah, we'll try and make it work." So we're testing it out. We'll see. It sounds definitely better, but unfortunately, I don't have a mic stand right now. So I'm holding the mic in one hand, and so I'm trying to keep maintain a logical distance away. So if you hear, there's a couple times where I get a little too close and hot. I have a feeling as soon as I get a mic stand, we'll correct that pretty quick. So, but ultimately, as you said, Mark, on your end, it sounds better. So that's hopefully.
Yeah, it definitely. We have more of an AM radio vibe right now.
Oh, yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Talk about some UFOs.
Yeah. So I think one thing to point out, and I'm going to get into the stuff that Daniel's like into, but his favorite record of all time. And I think as soon as I found this out, I was like, okay, I think I kind of understand where like a lot of his approach kind of comes from. But his basically he claims to be the most perfect metal record for him is Hell Awaits from Slayer. And,
makes a lot of sense.
That's an album that's busy, right? Like it's the longest Slayer songs, but it's also like fucking evil and sinister and weirdly produced, and all these different things kind of happening. And so I think like that's kind of the nucleus of his ideas is to be like scary but also like progressive in a long way. So yeah, because I mean at dawn they sleep and Hell Awaits, I mean those are 7-ish minutes long songs, and stuff. But
I think that was one of the Proscriptor's favorite records from Absu as well. Because one of the things I read interview-wise, we was talking about bands he was into, was Absu kept popping up.
Yeah, he definitely did talk about Absu. I think they probably toured a little bit because of the Mexico-Texas probably proximity a little bit.
I think they did off, it was the Enslaved tour with Absu and... Yep. What was it, like 92 or something?
94.
94?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, because he mentions that a little bit later. So, but Daniel, I found some different kind of interviews and things like that. And here's what he had to say. He says, I started playing bass around late 88 because there weren't any bass players around. After Cenotaph recorded their first album, their guitar players quit and it was hard to find a replacement. So we decided that I would give it a try. It worked for a while, but those guys didn't seem happy with my playing. And that was one of the reasons I quit. I was busting ass writing music and they didn't seem to like it. In fact, the first 2 tracks from the Chasm's demo were songs that were supposed to be for the next Cenotaph. So I quit and did my own thing. And so that's kind of getting him, on his path. But basically from this point on, like I kind of checked out a couple Cenotaph songs after. They kind of get like more melodic. They change their logo a little bit and they just kind of keep on plugging away without them, So, yeah. But, besides the band conflicts, another driving force for leaving Cenotaph was, quote, to an urge to create something more personal combined with my hunger and passion for metal. And so basically, the Chasm is created in December of 92, according to Daniel, when he started to work on his first and only demo, a demo called Awaiting the Day of Liberation, which eventually will be put out in 1993. And I think one of the things that's cool again about like that title that I wouldn't have picked up on had I not kind of poked around is the title's kind of based off of the Day of the Dead culture. The idea of the Day of Liberation, the Day of Dead, kind of thing.
It sounds like
coming back.
It sounds like a Carnage song.
Yeah, and Carnage is one of his favorite bands, so yeah, that also kind of makes sense too. But
I'm thinking of The Day Man Lost is the Carnage demo.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay,
yeah, because I was going to do a comic called that.
He talked about the Day of the Dead and just kind of the idea that in Mexico this like weird, and it's something like we talk about in my history class a little bit, that like Mexico and certainly Latin America in particular has like they have a weirder relationship in certain ways to sort of Christianity, because it's they of all cultures there had more what's called syncretism that kind of happened, because like they brought their Native American cultures of like the Incans, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and integrated it with sort of Spanish kind of Catholic Christianity, which obviously like Catholicism of Christianity already has like pagan aspects of it, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas like in North America, we were kind of pretty much a, you know, Puritan Protestant sort of background, which took a lot of the paganism stuff out, right? And so you had that happening. And then you also had like this intense slave culture that was being brought over. And that all kind of syncretized in places like Latin America and the Caribbean, much more than it did in North America. And so like, that's of course where you get voodoo, you know, because voodoo is like what happens when you take like African slave religion and mix it with Christianity. Well, you're going to kind of, you know, merge the things together. And so when you throw all those things together in places like Mexico, they have much more of a superstitious version of Catholicism, you know, mm-hmm. with like these very pagan rituals and things like that, which is
it's almost like Old Testament, really.
Yeah, it's some of that for sure. There's definitely the idea of, you know, sacrifice and you know, but they pray to spirits like more in Latin America than pretty much anywhere on the planet. And I think that's connected to the idea that they were coming from polytheistic roots before the, you know, Columbus and the Spanish kind of showed up and stuff. So
totally.
So it's weird. It's just always like a much more of a emergence of culture there too, because the other thing that was unique about kind of, you know, Latin America compared to North America is they allowed for racial mixing, and that was illegal in most of the North American colonies. Not to say it didn't happen, because it clearly did, but like it was definitely frowned upon. Whereas in like in South America and Mexico and those places, it happened a lot more. And so that's why you have like a lot more kind of racial fluidity in those kind of parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And he even talks about how his origins, like he has some kind of like Mayan Aztec kind of parts to him and some parts that are Spanish and stuff. And so anyways, like when he makes these allusions like Day of Liberation to like that culture, it's not because I think he's a religious person necessarily. In fact, I'm sure he's probably not religious very much or anti-religious in some ways, but he's certainly fascinated by that fusion of cultures a little bit. So it's kind of cool.
One of the best quotes I think I found, or that kind of sums him up a lot, is that I'm obsessed with death in every possible form.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he talks like, a lot about that stuff. And I think like, you know, you think about like the Aztecs, the Incans, and the Mayans, especially the Mayans and the Aztecs, they were really death obsessed, you know, mm-hmm. to the point where, you know, they engaged in human sacrifice and, you know, literally like thinking that the gods needed the nourishment of the blood of, you know, humans and warriors giving themselves, you know, like you said, kind of Old Testament stuff, right? You know, a lot of sacrifice. And I think they were very death obsessed, but again, like the Mayan calendar and this idea of its circularity and stuff like that, like that there is like an end point, but there's also like in a circular fashion, like a beginning point at that end point. And so,
which turns it pretty cosmic, you know, at that point, too. Like a universal cosmic kind of vibe,
which is kind of like where a lot of their weird song titles and shit come from too, you know, like one of the next songs we just heard In the Cosmic Solitude, and the next song we're going to hear is The Cosmos Within. So it's like, that's definitely like part of the DNA of these things. And it's probably something I never really thought about when I looked at these crazy song titles. Like, and I think like we forget sometimes because there is so much, you know, homogeneity in like the Northern European metal that we often talk about, or even a lot of the North American metal that we talk about, that, you know, when you do add like, you know, Sepultura being from Brazil and what they kind of brought into the music that was unique, you know, and things like that. We sometimes forget when we're talking about bands that are coming from, I guess, non-Western places, right? That it's going to be the more cultural fusion happening. I think that's cool. You know, it's
that was the thing with Sepultura in the 90s that just blew people away, because nobody had heard of a band from Brazil, mm-hmm. yet let alone like one that was like as good as Metallica at the time.
Yeah.
And it just fucking blew everybody away. And then when they you know, brought in like the more, you know, traditional stuff with the drumming and all that, it was just like, holy shit. Like,
made perfect sense. Yeah. And again, Brazil is a place that had this fusion of culture because they had the highest percentage of slaves in the entire Atlantic slave trade going to Brazil, you know, so
and just the native people, complete poverty they had in Brazil at the time too.
For sure.
Slums are just crazy.
Yep. Absolutely. So,
battery bullet belts.
Yeah, I love that story. Yeah, if you've never seen Global Metal, I show it in. I know you've seen it, but for Requiem fans, if you've seen Metal Headbanger's Journey or the Metal Evolution series that Sam Dunn did, check out his Global Metal thing. It's cool because it talks about globalization of heavy metal around the planet and things like that. It's pretty nifty. So, but yeah, so as he kind of throws the band together, what you're getting here is Antonio Leon on drums, and he's going to be pretty much the other kind of consistent member of the Chasm through this whole journey, you know. And you're going to have Eric Diaz, who will be with them through about 1997 on guitar, and then Luis Martinez on bass, who he'll be on the demo and he'll be on the debut, the Procreation of the Inner Temple. And then they kind of go through a lot of bass players, sort of Spinal Tap style, as they do with the drummers. But, you know, I think it's here, especially when you get to the Awaiting the Day of Liberation demo and the Procreation of the Inner Temple debut record, that you can kind of start to hear a lot of Daniel's kind of wide-ranging musical loves, where they kind of really start to permeate a bit. And so here's a list of all the things he mentioned in a couple interviews that I put together of stuff he really loves or grew up with and that he kind of brought into the band. First thing he mentions is Candlemass. So good you mentioned that. Huge Black Sabbath fan, Slayer, obviously, but he was also into like Italian prog stuff like Magma.
I can hear that.
Accept, Saxon, Tank, Creator, Celtic Frost. He loved Storm Witch, Priest, Dio, Sweden's Merciless, Ostrogoth. He was a huge fan of Vangelis, the Blade Runner score guy. Maiden, Absu, you know, you saw that as well. The Pentagram from Chile, he was really into. Arrow, which was a calypso band. Yeah, from the 70s. I've heard like their stuff before. I didn't know what they were called, but you've heard it in like movies or whatever. Yeah. Necrovore, Blood Feast, a band called The Happy Family, a Czech speed Nwabum kind of band called Citron. He was way into Carnage, Mutilator, you know, so it's a pretty diverse palette of things he's sort of drawing from. And I think it's probably like what you could get in Mexico, you know, like what stuff got there. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's hard to know, you know. It's like the story of Rodriguez, right? The dude from Detroit whose stuff got to like South Africa, like, you know, just
from the cutout bin.
Yeah, like we never heard like Citron probably, but like for some reason some Czech like speed metal stuff like made it over. Or maybe he was like really involved too in the tape trading community, as I'm sure he was. But yeah. So, and then he comes up with the name, and basically the name, he said, symbolizes and reflects the way I see my own existence, a very grim and dark mental and spiritual abyss where my deepest emotions are always falling and facing a very empty and stupid reality, better known as life on this traitorous earth, the chasm. So, yeah, pretty, you know, like you said, he's constantly obsessed with like the idea of death, and he's a pretty morose guy, but he gives good interviews. Like from what I read, he seems like to be excited all the time about talking. The one vibe I picked up on, and Brandon Corsair, who I mentioned earlier, you know, who's talked to him a couple times for other things he's working on. He's intense. But I think he's very frustrated as an artist, as a creative force, because I think he feels from some of the interviews I've read that they've like the Chasm kind of got a raw deal. Like they just got like one bad label after another. And that's like you said, their shit is hard to find. It's expensive. They just had like some of the worst luck on labels. Like they got on Dwell right as Dwell was crashing. They get on Wicked World, the subsidiary of Earache, right as that label is kind of starting to like kind of crash, you know, the Wicked World thing. So it's like they just never fucking had any good luck on stuff. So they end up basically near the end, they're like self-releasing things on their own label, you know. And it's, you know,
I bet you probably got a promo of something on Wicked World. That's probably where I first heard the Chasm.
Yeah, that was 2004. So yeah. So yeah. But yeah, maybe. I mean, I knew their stuff came up on samplers and things like that. Like I heard them on, they were on the Slayer tribute album. I believe they did a song. I think they do Metal Storm, Face the Slayer.
Yeah. They're on a Morbid Angel. Yeah. They do Abominations on that as well.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, perfect. But yeah, I found so I did find a couple interviews, like I said, and one of the interviews I found from 2000 from Metal Maniacs, and it's got Iron Maiden on the cover, In Flames on the cover.
Okay.
Yeah, from September of 2000, but it's with our old Michigan friend, our Marty. Is it
Reikkinen?
Reikkinen? Yeah. Who also wrote, I think, a little bit for Requiem and Eclipse at times too, correct? And had his own zine,
I think so.
Worm Gear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like the third interview I pulled up.
Okay. Yeah, did you find this interview then too? The Metal Maniacs one? Yeah. He also did one, there's an interview with Marty from Worm Gear too that was online. I wonder if that's the one you found.
Oh, maybe that's probably it actually.
Yeah, I bet you that's the one because I found that one as well. But he basically said metal music is like everything, the core. It gives me strength to keep going in this life that we're living. It's unbelievable how much metal has given me. It's not just about the power of the music. It's about the inspiration to do more for myself, to prove myself. There are some things I can live without, but heavy metal is like something inside. It's stupid and trendy to say so. Everybody's saying they are so, quote, true metal. We came to this life to do something, and I came here to create music and listen to great music, which is heavy metal. For the band, it's the metal of death. It's the force that really pushes us to the fucking limit. So, yeah. But, it's that's kind of what you get from Daniel. He's very pure, He almost reminds me in some ways of King from Deceased. Like he's a guy
I made that actually that same kind of thing. The correlation, not necessarily between him and King, but as far as Deceased and the Chasm, how they keep consistently getting better as they get. Well, they haven't peaked yet. I don't, Chasm probably won't do any more records, but how like the last 10 years, anytime Deceased put out a record, it's just a fucking killer.
Yeah.
And it's like pulling in stuff from all eras of metal. It's not like one genre or another. It's just like its own unique little thing.
Well, and if you listen to like all those bands I just listed off that he's into, it's like some of the same shit that King would probably say, right? Like obscure early 80s speed metal, proto black metal, things like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas like I doubt either of them are that interested in kind of modern trends that are happening. You know what I mean? All. Yeah. They seem kind of really disinterested in all that sort of stuff. But yeah, so I think Deceased and a personality like King and the kind of intensity that those kind of characters have, that's probably kind of a little bit like maybe how Daniel is sometimes, Mm-hmm. He also talked about in that interview about how proud he was of the Cenotaph album, but not wanting to repeat that with the Chasm. He says he always wanted the Chasm to never be false and to only be kind of authentic. He says, fuck trends and play from the heart. And I think that's true. I think that's probably one of the reasons they never got popular, is they just kind of did what they did. And it didn't matter what was going on as like a trend in metal, whether it be the 90s or the 2000s or whatever. And I don't know, that's good or bad, but
it seems like it's an expression of his mental state too. Like I think without this, he might be a mess to not have music to channel all these inner feelings and thoughts of all these philosophical thoughts that you can't really talk to anybody else about, but you can get your feelings out through music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no,
because all these are like it's like epic poetry, but in music form. Even if you take the lyrics out, it has this like classical kind of ups and downs and these big peaks and valleys, and like it's all real epic shit.
Yeah, especially when he starts, they'll start really working on a lot more instrumentals near the second kind of half of their career a little bit, and and those even tell great stories. And oftentimes metal instrumentals can be hit or miss, depends on who's doing them, but I think the Chasm does them about as well as anybody I've ever heard, in terms of being able to put together cool stories, even without words, So I think you're right. It's definitely a healing for him of some sort, or something he has to almost do to sort of live, Yeah,
it's a therapy.
Yep, absolutely. So what we're going to hear, we're going to hear one tune from the demo. And so the tune we'll hear is The Cosmos Within. And, it's kind of great early sort of death metal, early death, with those kind of Middle Eastern scales you'd hear on like Zombie Ritual or Pull the Plug or something like that, that kind of kicks off the whole song. And you get some kind of Dismember meets kind of like that Finnish death metal kind of riffs, kind of groovy, type
It's
things.
yeah, it's the amorphous Corellian isthmus sound.
For sure. Yeah, I wrote Corellian era amorphous or like convulse or zizma sort of grooves kind of happening here and there. And you get some real eerie, sort of slower, doomier parts, which they're going to really play with a lot more on the Procreation and the From the Lost Years records that are coming up next. But for a demo, it's got a lot of bravura. It's like, it's got a lot of fully formed ideas and concepts, and they're taking some pretty bold chances for just kind of a demo. So it doesn't all work. That's one of the things about the Chasm is they'll try things, and maybe you could make an argument. I don't know if that works, but I think it fits into the aesthetic of what I always hear you talk about, which is like definitely a band pushing to their limits and maybe pushing beyond their limits, but that's okay.
Yeah, playing at the edge of their ability. I think they're definitely a lot of that.
Yeah, they're definitely kind of a core of that. So that's a demo tune we're going to hear, and then basically we get to their debut record. We're going to hear a pair of tunes from 1994's Procreation of the Inner Temple, and it's on Belfaget Records, which I'm sure is just a really small Mexican label of some sort. And Daniel had a great quote about this record. I'll read, and then I'll hear some of your thoughts on it. He says, "If you hear our first album, the production is the worst ever, but the music is progressive. It's like a mixture of magma, camel, and Candlemass. It's our style. You can hear it, but I don't have words to explain what happened in that era. I don't even know how to play those riffs anymore. They're weird and original as fuck." So he no longer knows how to play these songs, which is
I believe awesome. It because if you listen to them, they're not notes. Yeah. He's coming up with like his own. Like when I first started fucking around with the guitar, before I had like a distortion pedal or anything, I would play like runs of notes that I thought would sound like like magically I was going to make this amazing solo, but that's what that sounds like. What he's doing, and it's totally like novice and goofy, but I love that. Oh, because sure. There's that, nobody can ever get that kind of like enthusiasm again. And you play it, you're playing it with conviction, even though it's completely wrong.
Yes. It kind of comes back. I mean, the Deftones did it in a simplified style, but I always use that as the example because that was the first interview I ever read with a guitar player where he says, "I don't know how to play guitar." And I remember reading that being like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah, the way I play is like wrong, but that's why it sounds the way it sounds because like I never learned how to correct it and stuff." And I think like he's kind of an example of that. And that's probably why he says to himself, like, "I'm not a very good guitar player, but his style works because it's so endearing and honest and heartfelt." He's never going to be as complicated as he is here, but I think that's in his DNA to sort of, take the kind of approach with that, but like you said, you're getting
production sounds like a washing machine.
Oh yeah. They probably cost like $100 or something like that. I mean, it's not good, and he knows it. They have recorded some of these songs again on other records through the years, so, but yeah, lots of dissonance, discordance, things like that. You can hear, even though the production sucks, that the rhythm section's really solid though. I'll give them that, if you can cut through the badness of it, like there's like good playing here, like there's cool ideas and
there's a lot of thought put into it. I think they definitely, even though they might be lacking in, their musical prowess, like they knew what they wanted to hear. Like everything's very melodramatic. Everything's very, I think there's a lot, like everything's full of emotion. If it's either like the doomy dirge autopsy kind of stuff, or it blows up into the, like fucking November Rain, kind of stuff. Like a lot, like it goes those kind of like depths from that to, it's kind of nuts how far every song seems to go.
Exactly. I think too, one of the weird things about this era we got to remember and remind people is 1994 is a really weird time for death metal. Death metal's kind of on the wane. 94, I would say, is like the real big rise of like kind of mainstream black metal. 93, 94. You think about the records that were coming out in 94, death metal wise, like it was stuff like Brutality. You know what I mean? It was like weird.
Which I listened to that last week and fuck, those records are good.
It's great. Yeah.
But they was becoming derivative.
Yeah, but at the time, like you weren't really excited about those records because you were into like the next thing, which was probably what Paradise Lost was doing, or Catatonia was doing, or Anathema was doing, or
dropping death metal.
Dark Throne was doing, or, you know, like that's what was really exciting in 94. You weren't like, man, I wonder what Incantation's going to do next. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I don't know. Like now I love those Incantation records of that era, but I was, you know, you and Chris were also in the same boat. We were kind of like out of this stuff, you know?
Yeah.
Which is sad because, you know, when you hear stuff on Procreation, and especially from the Lost Years, which we'll talk a little bit about before we moved out of the set, that stuff was like deeply entrenched in all the shit we loved, you know, the Peaceful 3 stuff, you know, but how would we have known, you know, unless somebody sat you down and said, dude, you got to hear this band from Mexico that's playing like Catatonia riffs. Like you'd be like, I don't know if I buy that, you know?
Yeah, I think that at the time, we weren't used to musical styles lasting either. Like, you know, punk was like 3 years and then it morphed into something else and then became hardcore. And then, you know, like alternative didn't last that long. Thrash didn't last that long. And like the longevity that death metal has had, that it's never gone away. It definitely has, you know, ebbed and waned and whatever throughout the years. But it's kind of insane that 30 years later, like Obituary have always put out obituary records.
Yeah.
You know, just like, you know, like
some are good.
AC/DC. Yeah.
Some are okay. You know, some are really
some are
great,
bad.
and some are, but it's like they're always obituary.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're right. You know, and so 94 was just, it was something that kind of hit me that like, what a weird time to be putting out your debut death metal record. You know, It's one thing to be an established band in 94. You could probably maybe survive, but man, to be trying to like find air and oxygen in a very like, compressed metal scene in 94 and be from Mexico. No wonder nobody paid attention to this shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It wasn't changing anything because everybody was like basically getting away from metal if they could, or getting away from like the death metal sound. Cause that seemed, the primitive thing was like a derogatory kind of term. And then would be, you know, Dark Throne would fully embrace it later on. And, you know, a whole other subgenre is like, that's the primitive stuff is like, that's the true stuff that never got commercial or never got too like melodic.
Which is funny because like on some level, the primitiveness of the Chasm is the production, but like the ideas are far from primitive, right? Like there is.
I dig that dichotomy of those two things is super interesting.
It's really like he's super melodic in a lot of things he's doing, but yet he's not somebody that wanted to play in Flames riffs. You know what I mean? Like he's not interested in that style of death metal,
but he's coming close.
Sometimes comes through.
There's a
on
lot Confessions.
Of Skydancer.
Yeah, Confessions. I would say is like Skydancer, Carbonized, Dusseltory, like all this like weird mix of that era.
Elf era at the gates. Elf Svensson stuff. Yeah. Early
definitely.
Tiamat, Treblinka. That's what I wrote. You know, stuff like that. It's real eerie, atmospheric. You know, there's melodic elements to it, but it's like left of center melodic, right? It's not like. It's not trying to be like In Flames Colony or something like that.
They're doing like what Tane would go on to do.
Yeah,
like they're doing this like it's brutal, it's aggressive, it's blackened, but also there's like incredible melody thrown in there too.
Yep. And so the song we're kind of talking about is the first song we're going to be playing from Procreation of the Inner Temple. So we might as well kind of set those songs up and then kind of get into it here. But Confessions of a Strange Anxiety is the tune. And like you said, it's got all those kind of weird, like left of center melodic Swedish kind of elements to it. But I also hear too, like that eerie riff that's over the verse sounds like real early Dance of December, like Catatonia, or even like Ulver, in terms of like what that kind of weird acoustic thing that they do sometimes.
Yeah.
Do you know? I don't know how to describe it other than it's like this blended acoustic element, but it's there to be pretty, but also unsettling. You know what I mean? It's not like Opeth acoustic. And there are moments in later on that will sound like Opeth that kind of come out through the Chasm's DNA, but this one's definitely more like eerie, Well,
there's like the gothy, Celtic Frost, Anathema bits, early Anathema bits that are thrown in the song too.
Yeah. I hear even some like Lost Paradise kind of Death Doom kind of, textures in there, some Soulside Journey stuff, and that riffing at like the 5-minute mark of this song, it sounds like Gregor, like Anders kind of worship. And I don't know if that's intentional or not, or if it's just sort of magically kind of coming through, but it's definitely there.
Well, all three of those bands are very emotive too.
Yes, absolutely.
It might be the common factor.
Yeah, he plays with the feel and emotion more than technique and stuff like that, and I think those guys do as well. And then the second tune we'll hear from Procreation, the Inner Temple, is "The Day of Liberation," the aforementioned. I think we talked about it. Oh yeah, with the title of the demo. Groovy kind of Stockholm death metal stuff here, mixed with some kind of dissonance, kind of death doom kind of stuff. So the second minute of this song, it has like a weird like Eucharist part with the bass. Where like the rest of the music drops out, it kind of is doing that like weird kind of stuff you'd hear on Mirror Worlds almost, or War Comp kind of era, before they kind
or
of
Hammer Smash Faced.
Yeah, some of that. Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah, I mean, Alex is a great, he's one of the best bass players in death metal, so it makes sense.
Yeah. But that's like having the drop. The bass drop was like, it's not done enough anymore. The same with cymbal grabs, like Chasm's like on point with cymbal grabs as well.
Yep. But I guess what I mean is the bass drops, but it doesn't drop necessarily just like for a little like bass solo. It drops, and then like the bass kind of does this like weird, like peacefully kind of like atmospheric kind of thing or something, or war comp era songs. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but I think you know what I'm talking about. I just can't really explain it very well. Good blast beat stuff going on, some killer kind of just traditional sort of death metal kind of blasting. But then like you start to get these like voivod kind of like discordant things mixed in with like these major chords that almost sound like folkish riffing about like halfway through. I don't know what band it reminded me of. I actually wrote, I know who it was. It reminded me of Panthemonium.
Yeah, I put like Old Rotting Christ, Anathema, early Therion, Liars in Wait.
Maybe that's that. Yeah, it's like all the not mainstream bands of that era, like not the traditional bands that everybody was ripping off. Not to say that you don't hear a Dismember riff or Entomb riff here and there, but it's like like Liars in Wait, or like Panthemonium, like Eucharist, like. That seems to be where like Daniel's like writing is, and that's pretty cool. Like
I feel like some of this record, it sounds like he was listening to Skydancer, like that was playing in the room next door, and he's trying to play along.
Yeah, no, there's a ton of Skydancer.
There's so much of it
on. I there's a lot more. Where did I hear a lot more of it on even some of their later records. I wrote it. In my notes
it goes, but he kind of loses it after a while.
Yeah, which is
like
fine
because a couple songs from what we're going to be playing. But
I think he kind of cycles through ideas, and then he just kind of gets to like the next thing. And it's not because he's like following trends. I just think he like works through whatever he's working through, and then he just sort of moves to the next thing he's interested in. And it's a weird way to be, but it's kind of definitely there. So. But the end of that song really reminds me again, like Panthemonium or just maybe Carbonize or just any of those like weirder bands that were doing stuff like that. And then we'll end with the tune, the first of the trio of tunes that we'll be hearing from the Lost Years from 1996 called I, the Pastfinder. And we can talk a little bit more about that song when we come back. So we'll hear the Cosmos Within from the Awaiting the Day of Liberation demo in 1993. Then a pair of tunes from 1994's debut record, Procreation of the Inner Temple. We'll hear Confessions of a Strange Anxiety and the Day of Liberation. And then, like I said, we'll end with a tune called I, the Pastfinder from the Lost Years.
Immortality in dimension of limits, with the flip of sights of material night, showing my lost paradise.
That was I, the Pastfinder from the Lost Years, The Day of Liberation, and Confessions of a Strange Anxiety from Procreation of the Inner Temple. And then we heard open with The Cosmos Within from the Awaiting the Day of Liberation demo from 1993. So now we've jumped ahead to 1996. And what you heard there on that last tune, I, the Pastfinder, is, I mean, the song sounds to me, and I'm sure you picked up on it because I know it's one of your favorite eras of the band, but it really reminded me of like Darren White kind of Anathema type vibes. As if they made like a progressive death metal record, if that makes any sense.
That know? And I put Riding Christ with Michael Stanne singing.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yep. Yeah. There's definitely, I wrote lots of early Dark Tranquility, that kind of melodic moroseness, and early Opeth, Orchid, Morning Rise kind of vibes throughout, especially those acoustic kind of flourishes and stuff like that remind me of older Opeth, how they would use the acoustic stuff. You know?
Yeah.
And even like, I don't know if you know the band, they were kind of a interesting, like kind of cool death metal band in the 90s. They're a band that, like, I think Dan Sidar like recently like recommended them to me for an obscure episode that we kind of were maybe thinking of putting together. But they're called Lycathia Aflame. Do you remember those guys at all? Did you ever hear them?
No.
So they had a record called Elven Fry. I don't know what that translates to, but it kind of sounded like kind of Nihilish. You know how like Nihil has like weird ideas, sort of. It was sort of like that. I mean, it wasn't Egyptian or anything like that, but it just had that kind of compositional sense to it. And I kind of wrote that it reminds me of like a doomier Nihil, or like even like a doomier version of like kind of the compositional approach that Lycathia Aflame band kind of takes. So, it's just the ideas are very different, you know, on this record. Yeah,
I put up like, it sounds like he's making up notes.
Yeah.
Or scales, like, you know.
The tone is so like pure, right? It's like so much in that Peaceful 3. The whole record is.
Yeah.
This record is impossible to find on CD. So if that makes you feel any better about your vinyl sorrows, I cannot find this for cheaper than like $125 on CD. So,
who put this one out?
I don't know if I wrote it down or not.
This is
another small fucking label is what put it, basically. While you're looking for that, basically what he said is, he says, this is Daniel's quote. He says, "When we did the Lost Years, those were the worst years of my life. You can hear it in the music. It's a 70-minute long album, which is really dark and has a lot of emotion." And I tend to agree.
On Reborn Records.
Yeah, again,
from Mexico,
another small fucking label. So the print runs of a lot of these things was super low, and I think that's kind of part of, you know, what makes it so collectible and stuff like that.
It was limited to 1,500 copies.
Yeah, no shit. So that's where we're at. So I told Chris to be on the lookout, like if he comes across it, like from some of his obscure CD circles or whatever, if he finds it for a decent price. But
yeah.
And it bums me out because it's one of my favorites of theirs, simply because it fits into that weird niche that I think people who love Requiem for a long time know that you and I fall into, in that it's like, it's bathed in Peaceful 3, Catatonia, Opeth, you know, there's lots of Paradise Lost stuff, Anathema, all those things kind of happening. And it's weird to hear a record of that era from the same time that those bands were kind of, you know, at their peak in a lot of ways, that we didn't know about. You know what I mean? Like that's what's so strange about this record. Like, oh, this is something we totally would have been into in 96, but none of us fucking had this or knew that we should get this record, you know?
Yeah.
And that's kind of weird. And, you know, I just think that for me, the foundation kind of anchors me to it, you know, in a lot of ways, even though I found like fandom on this record to be really split. Some people were like, this is the greatest Chasm record of all time. And other people are like, I want more of the like blasting death metal that they'll do in a few years later. And I totally get both, you know what I mean? Like I understand that, you know, it's almost the outlier record too for them. You know, nothing they do will ever sound quite like this whole record. And maybe, like you said, it's because he was in such a fucking dark emotional place that he just had to like work it all out. And then he was like, okay, next, moving on.
Yeah, I don't even know how to do these riffs anymore. Move along.
Exactly. But Marty kind of asks him a little bit about, how his emotions kind of channel into his music in that Metal Maniacs interview. And so there's some pretty good like answers he gives here. He says, you can't keep it inside. You have that urge to release feelings, whether they're good or bad. Feelings are natural. It's bad to feel like shit, to feel angry, but it's something that is part of yourself. You try to express that the best way you can. And for me, it's with the music. It used to get me really worried when I was in Mexico with the situation down there. You have to think about eating, working, and getting money. But I was just thinking about the music, about being creative and being authentic about what I was doing. I was much younger, but in those years, everything sounded so fresh. Even if there were a lot of records, it was just fucking unbelievable. There was true feeling. It was so pure. You know how heavy metal was in the old days. There were some bands that were really cheesy, but some that the really obscure bands like Arrow or Storm Witch, they were really fucking dark. They were the best because they were obscure and nobody gave a fuck about them. They weren't any bigger than the big bands in those days, but they had the same qualities as Iron Maiden or Saxon. That's something I'm part of. We like having distribution and promotion, but the bottom line for me is creating music that fits my soul to express the things that I have inside this vortex of emotions. It's something that I'll live with as long as I live in this fucking earth. There is no other medium for me. He says, you know how it goes. Sometimes you just want to pull the trigger. That's life, and you need to release your anger, and somehow you listen to metal, and it gives you the power to keep going. So I thought that was a cool little quote there from him, kind of just talking about how the emotion sort of channels through this sort of stuff,
Well, there's, I think on one of that, maybe it was that Worm Gear thing, where he's asking where his ideas come from, and he says his inner temple.
Yeah. There's actually, while you mentioned that, something from Worm Gear that I want to sort of mention. I'm trying to see where he's kind of talking about Mexico. I gotta find it now. Sorry, I didn't have it ready. But yeah, he's kind of just talking about like what was the situation that was kind of going on in Mexico a little bit and why that was going to kind of push him.
What, political climate and everything at the time?
A little bit of that, yeah. I'm trying to see here. Oh man, I should have had this one ready. Yeah, he's talking about Cenotaph a little bit. He basically says something like Mexico is totally screwed. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So he says Mexico is totally screwed. Economics are really bad, and that's why the quality of life there is low. We as a band were in a situation that we couldn't go any further. We are trapped in the misery of our country. I needed to find something better for the Chasm where we can grow and improve more than in Mexico. Living in the USA is boring, and the scene is not the best, but for us, every time we play live, the response has been great. We are still pretty unknown here, but I'm sure that it will change in the near future. We came here to conquer the States. It's going to be hard, but we are hard workers. We miss a lot of stuff from Mexico, but in order to improve our life, personal and for the band, we had to make some sacrifices. And that's why we ultimately chose Chicago, because we have several friends here and the scene is really good. And we came from a big city, so we needed a big city to live and not feel the sudden change. Because, yeah, this is around the time when the band decides that they're going to kind of relocate. Is right after the From the Lost Years record, and they're going to move up to Chicago and kind of be part of that scene a bit. So,
is there ever any? Did you come across any information? I didn't see anything like how, how did they become U.S. citizens or anything?
It's a great question.
I was just curious if they were on school visas or how that worked.
Well, no, I don't know, because I know that later on. It's I can't remember what record it is. I think it's not the record they put on. It's maybe the record in between Dwell and the Wicked World record. So the one from 2002 that we'll get to a little bit later. And he says,
Conjuration of the Spectral Empire.
Yeah, I think it's the one they put on a German label, but the German label did nothing for them for that record. And he goes off on one interview. I found this gigantic rant where he says that the person that ran that German label got super racist with him at one point and was like, fuck you, we're not going to promote your stuff. And she says, in fact, we might just call immigration on you.
It was Witch's Brew in Germany.
Witch's Brew, that's what it was. Whatever record came out, Witch's Brew. And
Conjuration of the Spectral Empire was the Witch's Brew one. Yeah.
So like I said, they just have the worst luck with labels. I feel so bad. And basically they did nothing to promote that record whatsoever.
Well, this is the perfect instance of how art and commerce doesn't really go together very well usually. It's like it's like crazy that it ever works.
I know. And this is a great band, like where it didn't work at all. And that's why a lot of people don't know about these guys, until years later, people discover them or whatever. But, which I think is one of the reasons why I was excited about doing an episode on these guys, because I just think they are the kind of band that, not to say we'll give them the Requiem bump, but I have a feeling a lot of our fans would like the Chasm or will like the Chasm when they hear this episode. And maybe we're in the same boat as us, where they just never sat down and had anybody like truly walk them through it and be like, this is why you would like these guys. They love all the stuff you love, you love Darkthrone riffs, you love fucking Anathema. Like, here it is, like Morbid Angel, like it's all here, so.
It's not pretentious, and it's 100%, underground and true. Absolutely. in the best sense of the term. Yep,
absolutely. And so I think that's kind of something interesting about this record as well. And then he talks about too, where is it here? On page 82, I got to go to the next one. I'm in the Metal Maniacs kind of issue back between Worm Gear and Metal Maniacs, but both are with Marty, so that's cool. He says he's talking about, let's see here. Oh my God. I'm not finding it. Sorry, I'll keep looking. But basically, it was about this record a little bit is what he was kind of talking about. First time. That's all I wrote down. Real smart. Yeah. Well, that's a bummer. That happens on Requiem sometimes.
Hey, it's all right. Yeah. We're a live to tape show.
God damn it. Yeah, I think he was just kind of talking about playing, in the U.S. a little bit, perhaps. So it must not have been like super important. Few shows went good. Yeah, he says when we released the From the Lost Years record, it was a really slow album. I'm really proud of it. I love it, but it was ahead of its time. I don't know if people understood what they were hearing. I think this might have been the quote. We got to a point where we decided not to play live anymore. There was no point playing in front of 4 people that don't understand the music. It's one of the reasons to make the move to the U.S., And then he kind of goes on a little bit about, just the idea that a lot of the Mexico scene is sort of people, they don't always appreciate the Mexican bands. They're super excited about the Swedish bands and the American bands, but they sort of shit on like kind of their own local scene a little bit, which I kind of understand. It kind of makes a little bit of sense.
But you dismiss it a lot,
Yeah, for sure. And just from a timeline kind of standpoint, it's also like kind of after the Lost Years record that we're kind of talking about, that Daniel gets kind of involved with Incantation. He had been friends with John McEntee for years, and in '95, so just before the Lost Years is put out, he actually helped them finish their American tour with Enslaved and Absu that Mark mentioned before. And by the end of '96, so right after the Lost Years comes out, he's asked to join the band. So that's when he leaves Mexico in March of '97 to go work on Diabolical Conquest, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. Which was basically almost done when he was asked to sort of join the band. And he added a bit to it and went on to tour with them on the Morbid Angel tour. But then he kind of says, I quit in the middle of the Morbid Angel tour, so you can realize how unhappy I was. Even if I had done a lot for the band, it was time to get out.
For where he wanted to just focus on his own personal stuff.
Yeah, yep. And I kind of get that.
And be like I would assume he wanted to have like, complete creative control.
Yeah, for sure. So, so he kind of is kind of getting into that a little bit. And so I guess before we proceed down too much of that, let's talk about the pair of tunes that we are going to hear from the Lost Years coming up, because I have a lot to say about these two tunes, Ascension of Majestic Runes, and perhaps one of my favorite, if not maybe, gun to head, maybe my favorite, The Chasm song, which is My Tideless Seas. It's kind of a song I feel like was almost like written for like my sensibilities and perhaps maybe yours. I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's lots of At the Gates and Dark Tranquility in there for sure.
It's a lot. It's kind of a melting pot of everything I kind of love. But, you know, the two tunes we're going to hear from that record, Ascension of Majestic Runes, the first one, it's got this great atmospheric opening with kind of layered acoustics, and then a killer, like Gregor McIntosh kind of guitar stretch around the 1 minute mark. Just a really great death doom sort of number. It's got a lot of like Finnish kind of melancholic, kind of a la sort of Sentenced, and not necessarily early Sentenced, but even like kind of a muck type riffs a little.
Yeah, you get, I think some of this, especially coming up in the next kind of area where we're going to go, there's definitely some thrash starts to seek back in, like kind of a black thrash vibe.
For sure. Yep. Killer leads and solos in the middle. I feel like he's upped his game with his solos on this record. I know he did a lot of strange riffs on Procreation, but it seems like he's starting to get a handle. Him and Eric. I mean, I'm sure Eric's doing some of these solos as well, the other guitar player. You know, lyrically, it's also kind of interesting, this Ascension of Majestic Runes, because again, it's evoking the cultural wonders, almost like, you know, Indiana Jones adventuring inside like Mayan ruins or something. You know, there's some that kind of image to it. I think is kind of cool. But yeah, so that's a fun one. But really, I think for me, it's all about this tune, my Tideless Seas, and this one caught me off guard when I was putting this episode together. I knew these other records pretty well because I had physical copies of them, but from the lost years and Procreation, those are impossible to find even on CD. They're so expensive. So I was like, okay, I'll go on Spotify. And I was kind of expecting to be like, not disappointed, but I just kind of thought, oh, these are probably going to be pretty primitive, you know, not really like fully formed, because I just didn't know anything about them. And then I was like stunned when I heard this record. I was like, what the fuck? Like, how come I don't know this, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, fuck, right off the bat, you get like this kind of For Funerals to Come kind of Dance of December soul sort of catatonia thing sort of going on.
Yeah, the early, like, mixed with kind of early, like, Wrong Again Records vibe, like this weird, like, out of tune shit. Yeah.
It meets, I wrote the War Comp. Like, it just sounds like a song from that.
It's like a greatest hits of the War Comp, really.
Yeah. I mean, it's like if War Comp met, like, also like Serenades and Turn Loose and Shades of God. Like, they're all like mixed together.
Well, that title is totally a My Dying Bride song.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
or it could be, you know, it has that like vibe.
Well, and it's interesting too, because there's things not just on this song, but throughout their career where they do dip their toe into, and they never quite sound like My Dying Bride, but they sound like My Dying Bride the same way Evoken sounds like My Dying Bride. And
I think it's My Dying Bride through Celtic Frost in the Pandemonium.
Okay, maybe that's what it is.
Because I think,
like, you know how
both those bands like really pull hard from that.
Yeah, and maybe that must be what it is. And so they must be pulling from some of those same kind of roots too. But like, yeah, there's just like there's a funeral march kind of aspect to some of the stuff they do, but they're never as like slow as Evoken. But then again, Evoken also has moments where they can blast too. So I guess it just depends. But anyways,
they have that dirgy kind of like, you know, funeral, you know, kind of I don't know, just like really slow dirge march kind of thing going on.
For sure. Yep.
Which is, you know, goes right back to Candlemass.
Yes, absolutely. Which is a huge touchstone for him, you know. And you know, right around the 2 minute mark in My Tideless Seas, you know, I just said, you get a riff that's my love of metal in one riff. And it's just this emotive fucking solo that then kind of emerges around the 3 minute mark. I said, is godly. I said, the blast beats blended with the cascading acoustic guitar is something to behold. And the My Dying Bride moving into North From Here transition at the 4 minute mark just keeps upping the ante. I said, you can just tell Daniel loves the epic dark dramatics of doomier metal like Candlemass or Merciful Fate, or even like early Manowar, you know, kind of doomier. I said, well,
there's some Manowar conversations in some of the interviews I read.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think he's just a fan of that old traditional early 80s kind of proto metal stuff. And
where he's coming from with like Manowar is not where we're coming from. It's like, that was cool.
Yes, exactly.
It didn't become like the joke, like, you know, because, you know, Venom, if you looked at them now as a kid into something in the, you know, 2020s, like they look like a joke.
Yep.
You know?
Yep, absolutely. And I think like, you know, that was kind of like where Wagner was coming from when we brought him on to our episode 200 to talk about that debut of Manowar. And, you know, he said like, yeah, I never like I appreciated their musicality and like how different they were. They were power metal in a way, but they also like doomy elements and stuff like Manila Road kind of had. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's actually making a lot of sense, you know.
Well, the tag epic metal,
like, yeah, for sure. But we were hearing like all the kind of weird, like late 80s, early 90s Manowar, which, you know, has its moment, but it was
a stereotype of itself.
Yeah, it wasn't appealing to me in the same way that
No.
like their first 3 or 4 records are, you know. A great blood-curdling scream in the song, too. That's really fun. And then after that blood-curdling scream, it kind of returns back to that sort of melancholic ending in the last kind of couple minutes. And just as you think the song might be kind of just moving to like an outro, you get this like Gregor McIntosh kind of lead near the end of it. And it's just like, fuck, man. Like,
yeah, this is one of those bands where when you think the song's going to end, it's like, you know, the third Lord of the Rings movie, but in a good way, where it just keeps like, you know, is it? Like, oh no, cool. Another passage that's fucking epic and awesome. And then it's ridiculous, but in the best, they're like, the excess is almost like power metal, but it's feels right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And maybe that's his interest in like kind of progressive bands too. You know, he mentioned like his love for Camel and Magma and things like that. And it's definitely there, you know.
Yeah.
But it's not wonky. It's not that kind of like progressive. It's progressive in like a Voivod progressive in that he's just like channeling a lot of different ideas into stuff, you know.
Yeah, like lots of different riffs, different tempos, but all those like affect the emotion of the song. And that's what real progressive music is just trying to accurately, you know, reproduce your emotions into music.
Well, I think
it just becomes complicated.
Yeah, that's kind of the debate that, you know, Wagner has in the opening chapter of Mean Deviation, where he talks about like, what is progressive, you know, and he uses the idea of like Angel Rat from Voivod. Like that's a truly progressive record for that band to have done, but people kind of hated it at the time because most people probably really don't want progressive music. You know, most people
they want to know what they know.
Yeah, they want the same thing that they think they're buying. You know, and I think it's, you know, there are some metal bands that people are willing to go on a ride with and enjoy what they do. And you and I have definitely been those type of fans through the years. But certainly, you and I have encountered bands that took a left turn, and maybe it took us a while to appreciate that. Maybe we never did, you know, and maybe that's on us. Who knows? Maybe it's on the band or whoever, you know.
I mean, I think it's a really fine line to walk with a band that completely echoes, like their changes are reflective of your changes. And if you're not in the same headspace, I can see why people don't want to hear it. Like why people don't want to hear, you know, like a fucking Depeche Mode Paradise Lost record when they were like sounded like the best thrash band ever. Why did they do that? Just because they were a couple years ahead or something. That's the great thing about like rediscovering all this stuff years later is putting it into context with ourselves at the time too, you know, kind of figure yourself out more.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And so it's right around this time too. And we'll get to, we will listen to some incantation stuff, not in this set of music, but after we listen to some stuff from Deathcult, we'll move back because those records both came out the same year. So it's arguable which one was made first, but, after he does, you know, sort of around the same time as incantation stuff is happening, he begins work on Deathcult for Eternity, The Triumph for Oz Records. Again, another record label I don't know anything about. And, you know, that's the title itself is kind of, again, hearkening back to that Latin American pre-Columbian heritage of sort of the pagan, Aztec, Mayan, Incan culture and death cults and things like that, which is pretty cool. You know, and basically he was asked, if I can find it, I'm kind of looking for it right now. He was asked by Marty in that Wormgear interview whether or not it was kind of a concept album about vengeance and death. And basically what he said is, he says, to live in this misery, in this traitor earth, makes me write such lyrics full of anger, hatred, and revenge. Life is so miserable and empty sometimes, and existence meaningless. All the lyrical concepts of the chasm are based in personal experience, feelings, and ideas that I emanate from deep within. All our releases are conceptual in a way, and all are tied together. I wait for better times to come, but the wait is endless. The chaos that rages in my inner self is the core of all my depressions, bitterness, and sadness. To balance this endless war, I conjure the strongest feelings of hatred, power, and victory. I claim for the revenge of my ancestors and to revenge all the lost years that I have lived in endless pain, to crush the false ones, the mediocre ones, and the stupid lowlifes out there. I want to reach the point of no return, and every day that passes by is a battle won, a new lesson in my preparation for the final destiny when I'll reach the portal.
I remember reading that last night.
Shit.
I was like, this dude is. It almost sounds like utterings of somebody who like has a terminal disease that's trying to like figure things out.
I mean, if
it's really interesting.
If I didn't know better, like it's like he almost sounds like a non-crazy like John from Dissection.
I thought that too. Yeah, that whole like, I've done all I can do for this, and I'm ready to join eternity.
But yet he never is suicidal, or you know what I mean? Like it's like he's on the other side of that, but he's like in that same mindset, but like music is still like saving him,
Yeah.
But I thought it was interesting too, like how he talked about, revenge for like what's been done to his culture too. It's like there's some of that, like I said, harkening back to kind of pre-Columbian kind of thing and stuff. So so Deathcult's a pretty fascinating record, and to me it definitely marks a transition for these guys. There's still definitely going to be the melodic kind of death doom stuff, but they're going to start to add a little bit more, I would say, kind of velocity and some stuff to the music. I
think
here.
German thrash, I think, enters pretty hard as well as Accept.
Accept. They're definitely big fans of Creator and Destruction and some of that type of stuff as well. So I guess we'll set up a song from it, and then the third song we're going to play in this set, The Revenge Rises, Drowned in the Mournful Blood, and then we'll talk about No Mercy when we come back here. But basically, after that pair of tunes from the Lost Years that we've already talked about, you're going to hear Revenge Rises, Drowned in the Mournful Blood, and this is the kind of album opener, and it kind of to me, it's like the band announces with that epic kind of instrumental opening minute that the game is about to change. And this is where Daniel truly is like channeling, I think, a lot of Hell Awaits too, Yeah,
I mean, even down to the like Araya screams and shit.
Yes, there's a lot of that. Those I wrote, fuck, he evokes some Araya screams even.
Well, how about the production is like completely different. The snare sounds like Edge of Sandy's Spectral Sorrows or Helmet Meantime.
Oh shit, that's
boom, 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 boom.
Yeah. Yep. No, that's again, who knows where they're making this stuff. I think this is the last record that they made in Mexico before he fully makes the move to Chicago. So
yeah, the Oz Records is from Mexico City.
Is a Mexico label. Yeah. So they're still dealing with primitive technology and just like minimal resources compared to like what you'd probably get in some of the places up here,
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But yeah, when it blasts fully into Drowned, the Drowned in Mournful Blood, that's where you get this Araya scream, and you get this one of the first major appearances of what I would call the kind of the Naglfar early In Flames kind of tremolo riff. Dawn is kind of in there too.
It's like high school kids trying to play Dissection. But awesome.
Yes, exactly. And then, man, at that 3-minute mark, and I hope you picked up on this too. Like you get that fucking Immortal riff all of a sudden, that kind of frostbitten riffing.
There's a couple of those throughout what we're going to be listening to, and it's always surprising, and it's a welcome surprise when they pop in.
Yeah,
but they're kind of out of nowhere.
Something like off of Pure Holocaust or something like.
Yeah, that's like one of those other riffs that, like, if you've ever tried to play those or tell anybody that knows how to play guitar to play those, nobody can play them the same way.
Yeah,
they're like it's a made up thing. I love that about metal, where you can do that kind of.
Yep.
Just make up your own vocabulary.
His own style of riffing,
Yeah.
I think Ben Ash, that's kind of how we hooked up with him, right? Was like his videos of like trying to play Immortal riffs.
Yeah, he was trying to play some of those, and he was like, what in the... like trying to play them correctly, because he's like, he's a well-trained musician. Like he knows how to play things correctly. And this is just like, what the fuck are they doing? Like the riffing's out of time. Like it's out of time, but it still kind of comes back around and connects at a certain point.
Yeah. Well, and then it like all of a sudden kind of goes from like the Immortal riff into this almost, I wrote left of center, like kind of Greek riffing, almost like Verathron or Rotting Christ or something.
Yeah.
And like even some of like the kind of weirdness you'd hear in like Demolish, something like that.
There's a weird mix of like Greek and Finnish a lot in this band.
Yeah. Again, the advantage of being not in a metal centered place, right? You can just like fucking do whatever you want and no one's judging you,
Yeah.
I mean, I even hear like weird, healthy doses of like atheist a little too, not as crazy as atheist, but there's definitely some of those ideas, and it's a fucking glorious tune for sure. So, so it's a fun one because it's like you get into this morose feeling with these first two songs, then it's like Revenge Rises is like, oh shit, okay, they're adding some of those, like you said, thrashier or like power metalish kind of elements without like the cheese factor of power,
and with like a almost like a black metal rhythm section with the the double bass blasting and.
Yep. The same way like Immortal could be just like kind of triumphant and catchy, you know what I mean? Like they have that spirit to them.
Has that bounce to it.
Yeah. Yep. So, all right, well, let's get into it. We've got Ascension of Majestic Runes and My Tideless Seas from the Lost Years record from 96. Then we jump ahead to 1998's Deathcult for Eternity, The Triumph with Revenge Rises / Drown in the Mournful Blood. And then we'll end with No Mercy, Our Time is Near. That was No Mercy, Our Time Is Near from Deathcult for Eternity the Triumph. And then we heard Revenge Rises, Drown in the Mournful Blood, also from that record. And then we kicked off with 2 tunes from the Lost Years record, Ascensions of Majestic Rune and My Tideless Seas. So, yeah, No Mercy, Our Time Is Near. Another fun tune from Deathcult. I mean, just lots of stuff happening there. Amazing solo, really great velocity. You know, it's one of the more intense songs we've heard from them thus far.
Slayer intro with I put a Slayer intro / early Sepultura and hella cymbal grabs.
Yeah.
Even the whole first 45 seconds of that song is cymbal grabs.
Maybe that's where I was getting like Dark Angel stuff from.
I put Dark Angel too. Yeah, Dark Angel at the Gates. Blasty parts.
Even some of the
Total Slayer ending. Yeah.
The breakdowns remind me of like Dark Angel, but obviously through like the lens of death metal, which I've come to maybe understand that maybe the amalgam or the metaphor, the death metal version of Dark Angel might be something like Cryptopsy, if that makes sense. Like
that, and I think they influence like Liars in Wait and At the Gates to a degree that we don't even get.
Some of that stuff. Yeah.
But it doesn't sound. They don't sound like them, but they're like their decision making almost comes from.
That's what I mean.
Dark Angel.
Yep. And just like how there's just riff after riff, especially those later Dark Angel records, you know.
Well, the one had the hype sticker, right? That had 500 riffs or whatever on it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think of like None So Vile, just how that was like such a like holy shit. And like there's a tune on None So Vile, Phobophile, and there's like breakdowns in No Mercy that sound like Phobophile a little bit. So.
Well, our first episode used Slit Your Guts from Cryptopsy.
And I've been kind of itching to maybe think about putting together a Cryptopsy episode down the road because
we've never done one, have we?
No, we have. Like I said, I like to try and move us around geographically. You get to Canada sometime.
Go to Canada. Maybe we could go down to Florida. We still haven't done Obituary.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, you know what I want to do for Obituary, because Albert even suggested I want to read that book first.
Yeah, me too. I've got a stack to do before that. But
so for those of you that have been waiting for an Obituary show for years, like we will. It's just we got the book. I just need to read. Maybe this summer once school ends. But the other thing that you get too is I love that Daniel kind of reaches into this like hyper screams on this record. He's really kind of going for those kind of things. And then again, another Immortal riff around the 3-minute mark of this song. Really cool. And then a solo that just rips your fucking head off. I mean, it's almost like Deathcult is the beginning of like a new band. And again, there's still the Chasm. Like you can hear the Chasm in those first 2 full lengths and stuff. But like, to me, Deathcult is like the announcement of this kind of new thing, for them. And I think there was a conscious effort being made, according to Daniel, to make Deathcult more intense. He says, I don't want to say we got bored with playing slow, but you need that intensity. He says, Deathcult is full of some real fucking hatred. So, and I think a lot of...
Do you remember when a lot of that, like war metal shit was coming out? Like Bestial Warlust, and it was really like tacking onto that like Blackened Death thing, but more of like an old school way.
I don't remember. I remember that.
I think it was like 96, 97-ish. Like this stuff, that's when this stuff was like starting to, I think the first time all that vibe of music kind of like came back into like a next generation of extreme metal.
Well, I think like Niflheim's part of that too, right?
Absolutely. I would totally throw them in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Niflheim and Bewitched. And in fact, there's some interviews I caught with Daniel where he's talking about like some of the newer stuff he likes. He goes, actually, one of my favorite bands is Niflheim. Mm-hmm. And he's like, even though people think they're retro, they're not. They're still doing like their own thing,
Totally.
So he's like definitely locked onto that, and that's where I think like the King deceased kind of thing comes into, because I think
and the whole
King.
Yeah, he's old, totally, and I think it's the whole like Hell's Headbangers aesthetic.
Yeah.
Like that's most of their stuff. Like Midnight, a lot of that is totally. It's like it's retro modern or something. There's not really a term for it, but.
Yeah, and I think like that's one of the interesting things in putting the show together, I think, is like trying to like put the Chasm into like an era. And to me, like they exist like outside of like any trend or era. Like they're just the Chasm. Like they weren't part of like the early Florida death metal sound or the Swedish sound. Like they're just kind of like whatever. They're almost like Vader. Like Vader just sort of exists, right? Like Vader
Vader's been around forever too, since '86.
And exactly. So like, you know, and the Chasm's been around since like '92, you know, whatever. So I don't know. It's interesting. Like they just don't fit anywhere, and maybe that's why, sadly, they're kind of a cult band. But it's also why I think you can kind of go back to them and get a lot out of them, because like they defy a lot of what you would expect out of bands of that era, you know. So,
yeah.
But yeah, we're going to hear one more tune from Deathcult. We heard the two in that previous set, and the last song we heard from Deathcult is a tune called "A Portal to Nowhere." And to me, like, this is a perfect song that kind of links old Chasm to new Chasm. It's kind of this encapsulation of them transitioning to this kind of newer sort of style, because the song itself is still bathed in kind of like doomier elements. But now I start to hear, you know, you mentioned before, you call it kind of like the mayhem kind of freezing moon kind of riff, but it's almost like what Thorns was sort of doing, you know, Satyricon in this era, the late '90s. You know,
I think Thorns took that dissonance riff from. I don't know if Mayhem was the first, but they were the first to make it like, you know, like iconic. But taking that kind of dissonant riff, and then Thorns turned it into their own thing, and then it turned into like Satyricon. Like it's crazy the iterations of that, like that one riff or that type of riff.
It kind of leaps over in the mid to late 2000s into like Inquisition too. You know, I brought them up before, but they sort of play around in that with that Thorns riff a little too. That sort of razor sharp kind of riff thing that they do.
And then that also like fades in, like some of the later on stuff that he's doing is using that, but then doing like the pinch harmonic or the harmonic thing, like Incantation, or not Incantation, but Immolation is like known for, you know?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And one of the things, you know, he transitions out of that kind of razor sharp kind of opening in the tune to like almost like Opethian kind of acoustics that sort of start to weave into the DNA of the song a little bit. And then I love sort of how they coalesce like around like a minute 15 into the song and stuff. And when they do start to coalesce around that time, like all of those elements, the song that it really reminds me of, and I don't know if this is one that you'll even remember, but it's probably my favorite like post 2000 Dark Tranquility song, Inside the Particle Storm.
Oh yeah, I know the song. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about? How like the energy in that song is like really weird and intense the whole time, like almost more than a lot of DT songs of that era.
Well, I was also getting in some of the songs we're going to hear a little bit, or maybe perhaps in the next part of this, I was getting some Anders Dvarp vibes on drums.
Oh, maybe that's what I was hearing.
He has that like that just like the fucking Slayer beat that's just slightly different, and nobody plays it exactly like he does. And that's one of my favorite parts of Dark Tranquility is how he doesn't play drums necessarily correctly, but it's his own take.
Sure. Well, and I think they were also one of the few death metal bands that use some like major chords sometimes too. You know.
Yeah,
and
totally.
And that adds like a triumphant feel. And I think there's a lot of that throughout the Chasm, you know, in various parts of their career, you know.
The band I was thinking that I could closest, like, as far as like philosophically relate them to is Manila Road.
Yeah. Well,
like what Manila Road is to heavy metal is what the Chasm is to death metal.
Well, okay. I'll throw another one at you because I wrote this down later on. And you're not wrong. But the other, you know, amalgam I sort of made was what Metal Church was to thrash, these guys were to death metal.
I would agree. These are great SAT questions.
Yeah, because I think Metal Church never fit in with thrash. They had thrashy parts to them, but they were almost like their own thing. They were more doomy, more morose. Probably. Well,
they were. Seattle I think they had more to do with, you know, the previous generation of just hard rock.
Yeah, like more priest isms and things like that for sure. You know, so. Yeah, like I said, the Chasm sort of just exists like in their own weird era. I mean, Manila Road, right? Like they don't fit into any era.
But they've always done whatever they wanted to do. Yeah, all those bands like that.
Yep, absolutely. So, yeah, and there's lots of cool neoclassical elements throughout that are insanely good. You know, at the same time, there's like discordant, like sort of blasting breakdowns about halfway through the song. I said for some it might be too progressive and busy. But when that melancholic part like crashes back in at like the 6-minute mark, I feel like kind of as, you know, I feel it, you know, like it's emotive. So like it's progressive, but it's not like doing things that like Tech Death does, where it's like unemotional progression, right? It's
like Dream Theater, where it's just like, here we go to Berklee School of Music and we can play all these
show
notes.
you some riffs and things like that. Yeah.
It's all emotional. Like a lot of these songs, if you don't pay attention to lyrics or the vocals at all, I mean, it feels like they all feel like, you know, this fucking warrior journey of like, you know, mowing through a bunch of guys, almost getting killed, and then, you know, right when you're about to eat shit, somebody else comes in to help. It's all just like, you know, Wagnerian kind of epic shit.
Yeah, no,
that's going
like,
on every song.
Like Beowulf, you know, killing Grendel or something like that, you know.
Totally.
So, yeah, and I mean, like you feel it too at that 6-minute mark, because that's that moment when Daniel lets out like possibly his like best scream, or one of the best screams of the career, and then he just ends with this like heartfelt solo at the end. You're like, fuck, man, that's like the November Rain part, kind of like what you're talking about.
Oh, it's like that. It's like Stellivore from Watain. It's like Waters of Ain, like those ones where like you want the song to go on forever, and it can in a live setting. Like I think we've seen them do Stellivore for 14 minutes or something, you know.
Oh, I just played that for one of our fans who's a student of mine. He had never heard Watain, and
I've been in a big Watain mode, like
dissection and catatonia guy, and I was like, dude, you've never heard Watain, but and he was like into Dawn. I was like, okay, sit down. It was like after school, and I played like Stellivore, and he was like, whoa. I'm like, yeah, dude, this is the real. I'm like, you need to just go home and spend some time with Watain. So
I'm pretty interested to hear the what is it? The Agony and the Ecstasy of Watain, the new record.
Oh, the new one. It's supposed to be a return back to some of the older
The two
stuff.
singles are just like,
they're great.
It's like back to, you know, Wild Hunt or something.
Yep. Or even pre-Wild Hunt.
Or not Wild Hunt. What was the one before that?
The one that had, it's the one after, God damn it. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's off.
The one that has the big like vortex on the cover. Is that the Wild Hunt?
It's incredible. No, it's not Wild Hunt. Wild Hunt's like 2013. This is the one that came out in like 2011 or something like that. So, yeah. Anyways. Yeah, I know. We're getting old. Slipping. That's the kind of shit I used to be able to like recall like right out of my brain.
You gotta keep talking about it all the time. Lawless Darkness.
Then we moved from 1998's Deathcult for Eternity to 1998's other record with Daniel, and that is of course Incantation's Diabolical Conquest. And Mark and I would be the first to tell you that we probably were not paying a lot of attention to Incantation in 1998, and we have voiced how we kind of regret it, maybe ignoring some of the TION bands, you know, throughout some of the second half of the 90s.
Yeah, I was into Onward to Golgotha when that came out, but I didn't keep up because it wasn't different enough, you know?
Yeah, and again, we were so interested in Europe in a lot of ways.
Totally.
And what wasn't like kind of, I don't know. I think we had, I know in going to like Milwaukee, you know, for a few years, like a lot of the American death metal stuff, like it was just like tedious sounding live, and you were just kind of looking for something different or something. I don't know. We were growing up, and a lot of those, I think the fans of some of those bands didn't seem to be growing the same way we were. And so I think like it wasn't the bands themselves. It was just maybe like the fandom didn't interest me, you know?
Well, totally. Like when you go to any of those bands, like the TION bands, it was usually that's where you get kicked in the head with a combat boot.
Yeah, it was like a lot of. Like, I wasn't into the brutality. I was intellectualizing music a lot in that period. Like I was really starting to really kind of, you know, put my, you know, I wasn't there to like mosh, you know, and that's cool.
You wanted to see
whatever.
the technicality. You wanted to see them play, you know.
Yeah, like I was just like, you know, I was like, in 1998. Let me give you just to put perspective. 1998, the American death metal band I was into was Death, you know, Sound of Perseverance. You know what I mean? Like that's what I was wanting in that moment. And, but now, hey, what's cool is we can go back and fucking appreciate how awesome these records were. Cause Diabolical Conquest, like you were saying off mic, it's a
holy shit
banger.
That's great. And that's like that's at the point of where you're like, all right, this kind of like style is over. And I listen to it, and I was like, God damn, this is a great record. Yeah. And it's $140.
Yeah. Oh, is it? No shit.
It's fucking expensive as shit, too. The records I was trying to get after listening to this stuff, I was like, I can't afford any of it.
Does Relapse doesn't have the rights to that anymore? Was that a Relapse record?
Yeah, they haven't repressed it since 2013.
Jesus, that's brutal. I didn't know.
So, and that was the same.
Thought all that relapse stuff was kind of available, I guess. But.
Usually it is, but the cool thing about that too is they had the same artist that did Onward to Golgotha.
Yeah,
a real like similar cover too. So I was like, oh man, they're just like hitting it on every angle.
Yep. Yeah, but Daniel comes in late, as we mentioned before, and he ends up contributing 2 songs to the record, and these are the 2 that we're going to hear.
But he also does vocals and bass and guitar for the whole record.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's a man of many talents. So
yeah.
It's a bummer they couldn't work this out, but at the same time, like Incantation was fine without him, I guess. Like I like some of the stuff after this.
But I think this gave them a really like a kick in the ass. This was like a reassertion of like how that they were important. This record was.
Sure. Yeah. And again, if he had stuck with Incantation, we might have missed out on like all these like fucking Chasm records. Maybe, I'm not sure. You know, it's hard to say.
Well, in McEntee wanted him to stay, but he was just like, I want to focus on my own stuff.
Yeah,
and that's
he
cool.
left mid tour, so I feel like there's something more there, but I'm not gonna cast a.
I mean, as somebody who doesn't like to work with other people, as far as in creative roles, or like when I do, if I'm going to be like doing a book, I want to be the creative force of it. I want to get other people to work on it, but I want to be the guy that guides the whole thing, that shapes the whole thing. If you get a couple of big interests, like big personalities coming together, it's tough. Like we work well as far as like we have kind of different personalities, different. It all works like we reinforce each other's personalities, I think.
I think we ultimately have the same vision of where we want things to end up. You know?
Yeah, and we realize what each other's strengths and weaknesses are, and we kind of like work around it. Or make that we work. That's like actually like what makes the whole show work. I think is the dynamic. But if you have 2 people that are so specific in what they want, you just like come to loggerheads. It's not fun to be in those situations.
Do you have Apple Plus? I can't remember. Did you get for Ted Lasso?
I just did for the first season of Ted Lasso, and then I got rid of it. But
so it's worth getting again, maybe. And if not, when you come over next time, I'll show you something. There's this show, and it's a friend of mine recommended it. It's created by a dude from It's Always Sunny, Rob McElhaney or whatever.
I've seen the first couple episodes of that actually.
Mythic Quest. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you get to the 5th or 6th episode of that? Where they go back in time to the it's Jake Johnson's episode, the dude from New Girl.
I don't think so. It reminded me a lot of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, it's kind of
that vibe,
So like the whole thing has like a Silicon Valley thing, and then all of a sudden episode 5 doesn't have any of the main characters. And it starts in 1994. And it starts with Jake Johnson from New Girl and
is that the dark-haired white dude?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Who I like. I like him in like Drinking Buddies.
A couple other like rom-coms too, right?
And he's a video game developer, and he meets another girl who's this like really kind of angsty goth girl, and they kind of fall in love, and she's like she's very like hyper critical of like video games and how fucking meatheady and dumb they are and stuff. And they end up collaborating together. And the whole episode is a timeline of them collaborating on this kind of video game that is uncompromising, this vision of it. And it turns out it's accidentally a hit. It's not supposed to be a hit, but it like kind of catches wind, and it sells a shitload of copies, and they sign with like a developer. And it basically, the whole episode takes you from the beginning of the development of the deal when they're just like 2 indie people. By the end, like their vision has been corrupted and destroyed. And it's like, it's such a brutally like beautiful, dramatic episode dropped in the middle of this fucking TV series. It's really bizarre, man. And it's one of the greatest episodes of like anything I've seen dealing with the art of creativity and that interaction of giving up your vision for commodification. Mm-hmm. And also sort of the collaborative vision of 2 people, because she wants to sort of stay uncompromising, and he is kind of getting dragged by like the corporate hacks that are like, well, we need to like introduce like this because this is going to sell more copies, and we need this and we need this, and we tested it out with this market group and they want this. And she's like, I don't want any of that. And he's like, but we got to give them something. And it's like, it's so pure and so like heartfelt and yet like heartbreaking, because like it just shows you like they end up getting married and divorced, and just like you're like fuck, and like it's 30 minutes, but it's just like this complete vignette story. And it does tie into Mythic Quest to the very, very end in an interesting way. And I think it sets up a metaphor for the whole series that like these people trapped in this are like constantly balancing this idea of like compromising all of their values for commodification, and also like trying to like make a product that needs to sell. And,
I mean, that's what I've been doing the last 15 years.
Yeah, and I think you
in a less
as an artist and
extreme way
appreciate this. Yeah, I think you would be like, holy shit, this is like, I get it. Even though you're not a video game maker, but you know.
But yeah, but that's what you're ultimately trying to do, is like you want people to come to you for what you do, especially in your field, but you don't want to completely, because you know, early on when I was really hard up for jobs, people would come to me and say, hey, can you do something that looks like this? And I was like, okay, I can do that. But now if somebody does that, I'm like, well, go to them. Why are you coming to me for this? Like, I want to do what I want to do. If you're trying to replicate other people, you're kind of spinning your wheels.
Yeah.
But if you get in a situation where, like, you know, you got a family, you need to get money, you're going to go for more like, okay, you guys want this? I'll give you exactly what you want. I don't need to inject myself into it. So there's like a really fine line of that.
Well, I think that there's that on a personal level. And then there's like when you get something into like a business, and then other people's livelihoods are based on the success of the product that you're now making. Like you have like employees, and now like you can't just like make an uncompromised vision, because then maybe what if it fails and all these people fucking lose their jobs, and like they're, you know what I mean? Like
totally, yeah. People
are then relying on you, and or
when you get, you know, shareholders or something, you know, like it's not about how creative you can be. It's about how much you can give your, you know, shareholders back.
Yeah, but I was really, really impressed with that episode. And it was funny because I looked on IMDb, and like, you know, I was just I watched the first couple episodes, and the ratings were like 7.2, 7.3, you know, good ratings, you know, whatever. And then I like look at episode 6, 9.5. I was like, what the fuck happens in that episode? You know, because that's like usually somebody dies, or, you know, it's like a Game of Thrones episode is like, you know, something crazy happens. And I got to the episode and I was like, whoa. And it was just, the whole tone was just felt completely different. And I was like, oh, I get why this is just like, it's like the body from Buffy or something like that, or Hush, where it's just like, it's here to show you what they can do when they want to do something like this, you know? Yeah. And really incredible. So anyways.
And do it when you can, because as soon as it happens once, it's probably never going to happen again in that environment.
Exactly. But yeah, back to, you know, Incantation, Diabolical Conquest, you know, basically what you're getting with this pair of tunes, Desecration of the Heavenly Graceful. And then I think it's interesting that, you know, Daniel
make sure it's Desecration with parentheses of the Heavenly Graceful.
Of the Heavenly Graceful. That's true. I think it's interesting too that Daniel shows up in Incantation, and I don't know if I don't feel like they had many instrumentals prior to this record. That's my hunch.
I mean, I'm sure they had some intros, but I don't think of instrumental on the record.
Like this.
No.
And I think it's funny because like that this is sort of like Daniel. This is like his mind, right? Like he's gonna be like the second half of the show, there's going to be a ton of instrumentals is what I'm kind of getting at. And so it's like, oh, he shows up in Incantation for one record and they've got a badass instrumental all of a sudden. It's like a great fucking standalone song, you know? So,
well, and the Desecration song, like that, how he named it, that's totally his naming convention.
The parentheses.
Yeah. There's always more than just like what the song is.
Yeah. And I mean, crushing vocals, crushing fucking riffs, pure evil. I mean, it
starts with a I Hate God feedback intro.
Yeah.
And then it's all like fucking Chris Reifert vocals. It's awesome.
Yep.
And dirgy bits. And
yeah, after the dirgy, you find you get these like patented like tremola riffs in it. And I don't know, I don't think that was a thing Incantation did a lot of at that point, you know.
They did a little bit of it, but it wasn't as Swedish as it sounds here.
Yeah. He's definitely come out like the, you know, that sort of sensibility for sure. But yeah, that's a really fun ripper indeed. And then, man, on Heavenly Skies, like you texted me today, you're like, holy shit, this is like sounds like fucking Paradise Lost. You know,
yeah, Beneath Broken Earth.
Yeah,
it's like real similar in tone, and like the especially the drum, like how slow the drums are.
Yeah, it's a fun tune, man. And again, I think this is a guy who it's funny. I never heard him mention like Paradise Lost or any of the like Peaceful 3 stuff. So I don't know if it's like an accident or maybe like they just both those kind of guys play with like the same kind of feel, but there's definitely like some spiritual connection between like what he's doing, what like Anders is doing in early Catatonia, what Gregor's doing.
Well, they all started around the same time. And if it has anything to do with, Frost, like Into the Pandemonium, what's that, 86?
87.
87. Like, they're doing demo shit in 88.
So they're all hearing the same demos, I guess.
It could be all that. It could be Candle. I mean, because Candlemass and Celtic Frost was like, that was a big, similar thing throughout all of these guys. So they could have heard it. It could have been in the air. I mean, that's the cool thing about this era.
Yep. Yeah, indeed. So, but let's do you have anything more about these incantation songs before we dive
I think the whole record is great. I listened to it twice today. I was like going through stuff last night and found out that he was on this and figured out like what parts of it he had to do with, and listened to those like a handful of times, and I was like, well, shit. Now
it's funny. I knew
it took
he
me
was
down
on
a total like rat hole down this thing about like, well, shit. Now I'm just listening to incantation records.
Well, I'm glad that you texted me because like I had been thinking about whether to put some incantation, but I was like, maybe is that too much of a side kind of quest or whatever?
I think it totally works.
I don't want to overcomplicate the episode, but then because I know I have a tendency to do that. I don't know if Requiem fans know that, but I have a tendency to overcomplicate episodes. So I was like, I'll just kind of keep it simple.
You add complexity and depth to episodes.
Mark and I are we've talked about doing an incantation episode down the road. So I was like, okay, we can, but then you text me. I was like, cool. I'm glad you're thinking this because I wanted to do this, but I just didn't,
I think it makes sense along the trajectory. I think it really,
it's part of his journey too.
Totally.
If the episodes we started with Cenotaph stuff, if it's about Daniel and his journey, like incantation's part of that for sure. So, all right, well, let's get into it. We got a Portal to Nowhere from Deathcult for Eternity, the Triumph. Then we got this pair of tunes from Diabolical Conquest from Incantation from 1998, same year as Deathcult. Desecration, parentheses, of the Heavenly Graceful, then Unheavenly Skies, and then we will end with a tune from Procession to the Infraworld 2 years later called Cosmic Landscapes of Sorrow, and we'll talk more about that and that record when we come back. That was Cosmic Landscapes of Sorrow from Procession to the Infraworld from the Chasm. Then we had a pair of tunes from Incantation's Diabolical Conquest before that, Desecration of the Heavenly Graceful, and then the instrumental there, Unheavenly Skies. And then we kicked off with A Portal to Nowhere from Deathcult for Eternity. So I think it's really important, Mark, that you kind of think too that when Deathcult for Eternity comes out, and I think also the attention that Daniel maybe got from being in a bigger band like Incantation, I think that's giving them a little bit of spotlight to get on a bigger and better label, and that gets them signed to Dwell Records, which is for them their first kind of actual label that they've been on at this point.
Incrementally big label, yeah.
Sure. I mean, they had some reach in America. I mean, Dwell was putting out those like tribute records and things like that.
Yeah, it was Paul Thine from Necropolis, and I think a couple other people that kind of came together as something. I did that logo for the Celtic Frosting. I never got credited.
Really?
Yeah, it was redone.
Oh, no shit. Were you subcontracting for Dwell, or was that?
Well, I did some stuff. I did some ad design for him before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like trading for product or something. But
got it. Yeah, they. And what I've basically read from Daniel is he said the guy that ran Dwell and that was a big believer in the Chasm, like he left right after this record.
Okay,
and that's kind of when the wheels kind of fell off, and they just didn't have the support. I think some of the other people in the label didn't really know how to run a label, and I think they thought that the Chasm was going to like blow the sales numbers like off. And I think like the Chasm is the kind of band, like if they're on a label for a couple of records, I think you can grow them and turn them into something, but you can't expect them to just like show up and be a thing. You have to you got to nurture that, right? Like
they're definitely one of those bands that need to be like what happened in the 70s when bands got developed, or 60s and 70s. Like you get a couple records to figure out who you are, go to a decent studio, get a producer, kind of like just focus on the music. Yep. And at this point with death metal stuff, it was like everybody's got a full-time job. They're doing this on the side, and if they got a family, they're like, falling asleep at the drum set probably.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, basically what kind of Daniel says in the Metal Maniacs record is, he kind of says that, Deathcult had been full of hatred. And he says with Procession to the Infraworld, it's like a concept, but it's a mixture of different points of view that I have about living in this world and going to the next one, which is the Infraworld, the world of the dead. That's the way I think it's going to be for me. It's difficult to mix that with strong feelings of hatred and misanthropy, being surrounded by people who don't have souls or brains. If I read my lyrics when I'm in a regular mood, sometimes they don't make sense, laughing. But then when I remember why I wrote them like that, I wrote those lyrics for me to create the full concept of the music. The concept of the Chasm is to release anxiety. And so kind of interesting, thoughts on that. But,
goes back to the mental health thing.
Yeah,
what about the, for Cosmic Landscapes of Sorrow, what classical song is that dun 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 dun. Like we've heard it in a bunch of shit. What the hell is that?
Looking at my notes, I just said it's a great example of how they might progressively move around in the compositional sandbox of riffery, but they always return back to killer rhythmic patterns and melodies.
But the open thing was like something that was like used in like Universal horror movies, or
really,
or something like very like.
The only things
specific.
I wrote down that were specific is I said, let's see, Roberto's bass work here is really stellar as he really pushes the intricate twin guitar into an epic sprawling feel before the killer solo at the 3:05 mark soulfully takes over. I said it's emotive, almost in an aphalamia kind of way, mixed with dissection.
Okay.
So that's all I was kind of hearing. I put
more Anders Djarp on drums, Nocturnal Culto vocals.
Okay, yeah.
I was really feeling that. The great melodic. This is like another one of those great melodic riffs that helps build into this sorrowful riff into a triumphant one. The whole solo kind of thing, where he's just like doing that Watain. It's just like epic stuff constantly.
Sure. Yeah. No. Did you pick up there were a couple times where I picked up on like some kind of aphalamia stuff. I don't know if like that's something you would have
no, but
grabbed onto.
I get the like the more just like obtuse, weird, choices.
Yeah,
I get
that's
that
what
for
I
sure.
mean, maybe.
Yeah,
for sure. Yep. But that's kind of something that I kind of grabbed onto a little bit though too. But
I could see that.
Just from a kind of a band perspective, after they signed to Dwell, they lose Eric, their second guitar player, and they bring in Robert Vale on bass for one record. All right, before he gets homesick and goes back to Mexico. Although Roberto Vale, but he's going to actually join back up later for the other project that Daniel will get involved with, Asarus. Yeah. And so it's kind of interesting. So he's there for one record with the Chasm and then disappears, but he'll return like 13 years later. And then they bring in a guy named Julio Viterbo as the second guitarist, who had been in Cenotaph. And he actually was never in Cenotaph with Daniel. I think he replaced Daniel kind of in the new Cenotaph stuff. And he was also in another band. I've heard of them, but I've never heard them before. Shub Niggurath. Have you heard those guys before? I think it's like a Mesopotamian or Babylonian like demon or something like that.
Okay,
but,
that makes sense.
I think they're just a Mexican kind of death metal band of some sort. And he even helped a little bit, according to the Metal Maniacs interview, kind of compose some of the parts of the album. And he kind of basically told Marty that he's definitely more technical, the guitar player. So if you hear some of the more kind of technical sort of stuff happening, that's probably more Julio. So
Okay.
Yeah. So kind of interesting because Eric has been there kind of since the beginning. And so now they bring in a new second guitar player, and that can kind of, change the personality of the band a little bit. But I mean, Procession, the Infraworld, for a lot of people, this is the one that I used to see at the record store. This is like the one that kind of really gets them out in the open a lot more. And he even says the way the band constructs riffs is, so odd and original. I said someone somewhere I read about actually compared them to Abigor in terms of how they construct riffs. And I don't know enough about Abigor, but I thought that was
I could see that. I mean, I listened to him a couple times this year just because I was like, how is this band still around?
Yeah.
But they've changed themselves so much that they're kind of like a septic flesh almost. They're crazy.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I just know the early Abigor stuff, but I wouldn't have made that connection,
Yeah. Like they got kind of abstract and symphonic and weird. And
that's weird. I wouldn't have thought that. So
Either.
here's a review on this record from a webzine from 2001 called Gnosis. I don't know. I think that's a reference to like Gnostic kind of beliefs. And I thought this was kind of summarized a lot of what's kind of going on with this band and stuff. It said, every so often a band comes along that either defies preconceptions and completely redefines what metal can be, or they create metal so intense and so pure that it completely renews my metal faith. If it wasn't for bands such as Voivod, Coroner, Carcass, Gorgut, Sigh, and Dissection, just to name a few, I might have completely given up on metal and become a total jazz, prog, fusion snob a long time ago. And now I can add the Chasm to that list, and just when I needed them the most. The Chasm has this total fanaticism of a true heavy metal zealots. These guys are totally down for the cause, and it definitely shows in their music, especially in light of some of the more visible bands that care more about image or spouting off about being, quote, true metal. Compared to the Chasm, these pretenders are just boy bands dressed in corpse paint and black leather. The Chasm hasn't claimed... It's funny because you got to put this in like... 2001 was sort of like the peak of kind of imagery black metal stuff, like gothic black metal, and you know what I mean? Like a lot
Dimmu
of
Borgir was huge
stuff
at this point.
Yeah, Cradle of Filth's kind of at their apex of their powers and stuff. And we liked that stuff, at least like those bands, but like their imitators and a lot of their fans and stuff, it got kind of weird, So
diluted. Yeah.
Yeah. The Chasm haven't claimed to reinvent the steel on their latest release, but they have created a truly great metal album. The music is passionate and powerful, and there is a deep understanding and reverence for metal's illustrious past. The Chasm does not waste their time running in the ridiculous, more extreme and brutal than thou rat race. Not to say those guys can't cave in a skull when the need be. Instead, they focus their energies on songcraft and atmosphere, honing their metal to perfection. At the risk of sounding pretentious, I would say Procession of the Infraworld is the album that Morbid Angel should have made on Gateways to Annihilation. Should have made. On Gateways to Annihilation, Morbid Angel was going for this larger-than-life, Cthulhu rising from the bottomless pit vibe. And in some ways, they succeeded. But in the process, they lost a lot of the frenetic and chaotic energy that makes Morbid Angel special. Well, the Chasm beat Morbid Angel at their own game this time. Procession of the Infraworld is malevolent and incomprehensible in proportion, the musical equivalent of an ancient and alien evil that has been disturbed after several thousand eons of slumber. The first thing that truly blew me away on Procession was the unbelievable production. It is so immediate and in your face. You feel like you have your head right in the drummer's kick drum. And speaking of the drums in the album, they're just spectacular. This guy is just constantly hitting something, keeping such a frenzied pace. But at the same time, you can tell there is not one time anywhere on this album where he isn't in total control of his kit. Just fucking spectacular. A major ingredient in the Chasm sound is old school Euro death metal, a la Dissection. Not to say the Chasm are Dissection clones, but they do use the same vocabulary, arpeggios and exotic chords, along with intricate but fluid riffs. In fact, the Chasm may be the band to knock Dissection off their exalted pedestal as the kings of melodic black and death metal. A few have come close, like God Dethrone's Bloody Blasphemy, for example. I don't know about that, but that's
I don't know about that either.
That's a different. That's a side conversation.
I think they definitely drink from the same waters as Dissection.
Yeah. So the last little part's just kind of whatever. But
God Dethrone has never grabbed my attention that much.
Yeah, I liked a couple of their first early records, but that's it. It's not a band I have a lot to say about.
Sure.
But I thought that kind of captured sort of the energy of 2001 and kind of just the weird place that death metal was in, and how if you really were locked into a record like this, if we had paid attention, I think we would have probably said the same thing. Like, holy shit, this is really, what death metal kind of needs in this sort of timescape.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, anyways, just kind of a fun little thought there that I found. Because we didn't. I like I said, I looked for reviews that we did of these records, and I couldn't find any. But kind of bums me out. I always like to read our old reviews and see if they're relevant. So,
I mean, they tried to give as much an honest response as we could with our limited skills at the times.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to sort of close part one of this with another tune from Procession to the Infraworld. And like I said, this isn't like we're not taking like a weeks long break between or anything like that. But just like I said, trying to maybe divide the episodes up, see if it's a little bit more digestible for people to sort of enjoy. So I guess I'll say, just in case you're at the halfway point here, if you do like what we are doing and you want to sort of contribute to what we're doing, that we're non-commercial and we're putting a lot of research and time into all this, you can go to patreon.com/Requiem podcast and become a supporter. And we really would appreciate that. Leave us a message or a rating on iTunes, Apple Music, Spotify, all those kind of places. That would be really, really helpful as well. And then you can kind of check us out and all the kind of social media stuff. But just wanted to plug the Patreon at the halfway point, just in case, people don't make it to the end of some of our 6.5 hour episodes and maybe they never hear about Patreon and don't know. The last one we did was pretty epic. It was a 2-part best of 2021 episode. And there's some other ideas we have for stuff. We've been pretty busy with how intense the Misfits and Dead Kennedys episodes kind of got. So we're due to kind of sit down and do a Patreon show. In fact, Mark and I might have already come up with a pretty easy idea to lock into kind of the Chasm era a little bit too. I think maybe, kind of something that kind of vibe.
Well, not necessarily easy, but like a less research.
Yeah, maybe something we'll just kind of do like we used to do our old episodes, where it's just kind of fun, talking about some songs.
Which is what we've heard from a lot of people enjoy us, like a less formalized version of the show.
For the Patreon stuff, yeah. If you're new to the Patreon stuff, it's definitely more conversational. We often talk a lot about comics and movies and other things that we're kind of into that we know we'd like to talk more about on these episodes, but we know we got to get to the place we got to get to, and
we can't go 14-hour episodes.
Yeah. Exactly. So we're going to close out part one with a second tune from Procession of the Infraworld here, and it's Storm of Revelations. And It is the closing track on the record, so it's appropriately a nice way to sort of close out part one here. And this, to me, speaking of dissection, takes like Storm of the Light's Bane and like Dawn Slaughter Sun formula, and it kind of throws its own sort of arcane, occultish kind of energy on top of that mix. You know, kind of switching back and forth from the kind of sweeping melancholia to these kind of aggressive bursts of blasting that like Knight's Blood and stuff like that on Storm had, you know. I saw that triumphant solo at the 4:15 mark into the staccato prog death metal dance before crescendoing into a major chord, fuck yeah, the gallery solo, before locking back into a tremola fest with hammer-ons should make Nile, Morbid Angel, and Anata fans blush alike. I said from 4 minutes to the end, they cannot be stopped. So that was
I think the Chasm, Watain, Dissection, like that's become a little triumvirate now of bands that are kind of like, you know, taking on that, you know, because I think Dissection might have been the first to really perfect it. And then Watain came around and nobody ever made any mention about Dissection at all.
Yeah.
But, some of the members were in Dissection for live. Sure. So I know, you know, Eric played live guitar with them, Set Tight, and played live guitar. So, like, it's definitely a lineage there. And it's not redundant, but it's just like this. There's not a whole lot of bands that can pull that off.
No.
That can do the melodic thing and like the dark, really, really dark, but then really melodic thing.
Yeah, and it's still death metal, but it has blackened moments, I think, you know. Whereas I think Watain's coming from more of a blackened sort of side. Dissection, it's hard to know because they had so much death metal in them, you know, in their DNA. Oh,
and so much thrash in them as well. But Sweden has like this inner, like you're born with some type of like melody. So like all these people, you know, you've got, you know, ABBA to Entomb to all these bands have that like innate melody.
Ace of Base even, you know.
Of course.
So can't leave them out of the equation. So, but yeah, it's a fun one to sort of end on. So yeah, Storm of Revelations. I mean, even sounds like a fucking Dissection song.
Totally.
Right? Storm of Revelations. You know what I mean? So
it's the next EP.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we'll be back for part two, but we're going to end part one, like I said, with Storm of Revelations from Procession to the Infraworld. So enjoy.